Chapter 11:28. As the natives of the abyss, most demons were imprisoned here forever. Apart from the inherent fear of the abyss, most demons were enslaved and tortured by more powerful demons. Their only relief was to torture other people, that is, demons weaker than them, or visitors from the abyss who could be fought and tortured. The premise was that they could not find a way to escape. Very few demons had the ability to leave the abyss. Ironically, demons with this ability often had the least reason to leave the abyss. They were the strong of the original plane and ruled other demons. Unless they were summoned by the abyss to spread chaos to other planes, these demons would focus on maintaining the power to fight against competitors instead of finding trouble with other races in the multiverse. However, many times, the appearance of demons in the material plane was a big trouble in itself. They were the spokesmen of chaos and evil. They tended to solve problems directly with violence and could cause destruction in various ways. Sometimes, demons in the material plane would play the role of lone wild beasts. Sometimes, they were slave masters who put shackles on their slave. They were even raw materials in some dangerous magic experiments. If one had to classify the roles according to behavioral logic, of course, this was only an analysis conclusion drawn by demonologists from the perspective of a bystander. When demons acted on their own, they were not very logical. Then demons in the material plane could usually be divided into three different types: assassins, berserkers, and corruptors. The blade of an assassin always pierces the enemy's heart. Find the target and kill him. This was the creed of the demon assassins. Demon assassins moved secretly and were good at trick. Chaos was their cape, and cruelty was their armor. Although all demons were essentially killers, these assassins' fanaticism for killing had reached a new height. For most demons, killing symbolized the climax of destruction. Many demons liked to torture their targets slowly to create greater pain. But assassins were not like that. When assassins attacked, their only thought was death. If death could cause chaotic pain, that would be good, but killing the target was always the primary goal. In addition to assassins, there was another type of demon that was more typical, and that was the demon berserker. The latter was violent through and through. Every demon had the element to become a berserker. Although many demons loved to show off their strength and were almost never afraid of fighting in close combat, the barbaric nature of war berserkers had reached a whole new level. Sacrificing a safer and more certain victory in exchange for a slaughter that reached the core of their being was something that demon war berserkers would often do when they were bored or wanted to have some fun. Zhang Kuang had a wide variety of weapons to choose from, including his physical strength and any external power. The Devil Berserker started every battle with his strongest attack. He enjoyed moving through hand-to-hand combat, tasting the pain and fear of his enemies. Even though they seemed simple-minded, one shouldn't underestimate war maniacs' tactics and intelligence. After all, most demons were actually very smart. With a little training, they would be able to grasp knowledge that was difficult for mortals to understand. Therefore, even the Devil Berserker wouldn't give up on using tactics to deal more direct damage. Of course, there were also many terrifying Devil Berserkers who didn't seem to understand the concept of retreat at all. They seemed to understand the meaning of the word retreat as, find a random direction and launch another charge. These guys were very troublesome. When the battle reached its climax, they would even fight to the death. Demon assassins and demon berserkers were both troublesome and terrifying existences, but compared to the corrupted, they paled in comparison. Even the boldest and most experienced expert in the study of demons wouldn't be willing to come into contact with the corrupted. Some demons of certain races were keen on corrupting mortals. The will of the abyss was also extended through the corrupted, causing mortals and the material world to intertwine with its image. What the corrupted were obsessed with wasn't blatant destruction, but slow corruption. In order to gradually lead the abyss into the prime material world, the corrupted would use favor and voluntary service to tempt mortals. However, their chaotic and evil nature meant that they were destined to be unable to use word games or contracts to negotiate like the devils. Usually, the corrupted would use some coercive methods, such as taking the initiative to propose, promise, threaten, or request. Their goal was always to control mortals and make them serve them, whether they were willing or not. There had been some demon scholars or mages who wanted to take advantage of this to gain benefits from the corrupted. In fact, there were some talented people in the multiverse who had found loopholes in the contracts of the Batsu people and then controlled the devils in reverse. However, those who wanted to use these methods to deal with the corrupted ended in miserable failure without exception. As mentioned before, demons were not devils. They were the representatives of the chaotic and evil characteristics of the abyss. The corrupted seemed to act with a goal, but in fact they weren't that tendentious. They were only corrupted for the sake of corruption. Sometimes there was no such thing as a conspiracy behind their actions. Even the existence of the corrupted in the material world was a kind of corruption in itself. The most obvious evidence was that after the corrupted came to the material world, they would always establish a base in the prime material world. They would find or create a nest with the characteristics of their homeland. The corrupted didn't just want to corrupt living things. They tried their best to turn the material world and all other planes into the reflection or extension of the abyss. For example, a haunted castle, an unfathomable well, a maze-like cave hidden in the mountains. These places could become the corrupted's home. Of course, these places were usually not far away from the settlements of mortals. After all, the corrupted liked to play with the weak and helpless souls of mortals the most. The reason why the wasp wine merchant Gurkha asked the adventurers to help him deal with a thief was that he knew that a corrupted demon had come near his home. He, she, it, whatever it is. Anyway, its existence itself is a mistake. A huge mistake. Gurkha explained the trouble he encountered in detail to Halamond and the others. It could be said that Gurkha was heartbroken. Using the bacterial tower to collect human emotional factors to blend Marapi wine will not cause harm to the collected people. I have been running this business here for more than 10 years. Although this place is full of slight violence, there is no shortage of joy and pleasant emotions. However, after the appearance of the evil corrupter, all the mortals were inadvertently contaminated. Their souls were tainted. Even though the current situation was mild and reversible, Malapal's emotion adsorbent was very sensitive, and the fine wine made from the emotions collected by it would not lie. The existence of the corrupter had turned everyone's emotions into something as disgusting as the pus of human nature. No matter how I regulate it, this batch of Marapi wine is ruined. So Keys was secretly showing his ability to mobilize the true thoughts in his heart, so the wasp wine merchant Gurkha became more and more agitated. In the end, he even took out a leather-wrapped account book and loudly complained to Halamond and the others about the losses caused by the corrupted demon. This is no longer as simple as losing some money. That guy stole my honor, Gurkha emphasized. Because he was too agitated, he couldn't help but make a little buzzing sound when he spoke, like a bee flapping its wings. For 21 years, through the platform of the scale of perpetual order, the products I delivered to the customers have never been delayed or had any quality problems. But now, because of a demon bastard who is said to have fled from Valensburg, this record is about to be destroyed. That bastard stole my honor. Hearing Gurkha's words, even the dwarves, who didn't think highly of merchants in the blending business, felt some sympathy for the wasp wine merchant. Halamond, on the other hand, was interested in the demon who fled from Valensburg, mentioned by the wasp wine merchant. So, you've already found out some details about the corrupted demon? Halamond asked. The wasp wine merchant frowned, trying to find a more suitable wording. I can't say that I've found out, but I do have some ability to control bees. Those cute little guys, who are busy collecting honey every day, told me that many of the places they often go to for food, from Valensburg to our place, have been contaminated. Combined with the information obtained from the sheriffs and legal narrators in several neighboring towns, they said that Sheriff Mischius in Valensburg was killed by a demon, and they are busy searching for the demon who committed the murder. I speculate that the corrupted demon must have felt that the situation was not good, so he fled all the way to this traditional, lawless place in Top to hide. Halliman nodded and was about to say something, but Keyes, who used the pseudonym of Hugh Hood, beat him to it and asked, "You have so many sets of Merapy emotion adsorbers in your bacterial tower." He pointed to the 36 equal-sized protruding prismatic liquid sacs on the wall of the second floor of the bacterial tower, which contained the diluted Merapy. "Have you checked them separately? Which one has the worst emotion adsorbed?" "Do you know what I mean?" Hearing Keyes's words, Gurka was stunned for a moment. He really didn't understand. However, Harriman immediately reacted. "The demon-corrupted demon has the habit of building nests. Even if he fled here to hide, he would definitely create some home field advantage for himself," the young master of the Green family quickly explained to the Wasp wine merchant. "Distinguish which direction has the worst emotion adsorbed, and you should be able to determine where the demon's nest is." Suddenly, Gurka's eyes lit up. "You mean, you're willing to accept my mission to slay the demon?" Halliman thought for a moment and said affirmatively, "Although I can't tell you why, I'm here to kill powerful monsters to prove my bravery. Since there's a demon-corrupted demon here, he must be a good prey." Keyes smiled. The dwarf Grinder was so happy that he could not help but touch the battle-axe on his back. Only Old Weather, who was sent by Patriarch Grimm to record Halliman's coming-of-age ceremony, frowned. But he didn't say anything. As Halliman said, demons were indeed powerful monsters. The demons from the underworld were much more difficult to deal with than the tundra trolls. It was impossible for the Green family not to recognize them as a hunting target. But, in this way, the risk factor of Halliman's coming-of-age ceremony would increase a lot. "At worst, I'll just go all out," Old Weather thought helplessly. "I've lived for more than 50 years. I've earned enough." Chapter 11:29. Perhaps Gurka was a skilled blender, but it was not so good at wine tasting. Even after using all of its primeval power, it could only tell that the molliple mood adsorbent in the liquid sacs on the west wall of the mushroom tower tasted the worst. It could not tell which one it was. Even the dwarves, who loved wine, did not want to try the half-finished honey wine in the liquid sac. Therefore, when Harriman and his group left the mushroom tower, they could only head west. The only commendable thing was that Gurka was very generous. As it said, "The Merapy wine I've produced over the past decade has always been in short supply." In addition to the small bag of coins, it also promised that if Harriman and his companions could defeat the demon, it would give them a sum of twice the previous amount. After all, the money was all gold. Selling wine has always been a good business. After leaving the mushroom tower, the dwarf Grinder could not help but sigh. Keyes, who used the pseudonym Hugh Hood, also nodded. "The hobby business has always been like this. It's a high-profit business. However, it's not a huge profit, nor is it a huge profit." These words also aroused Harriman's interest, and he joined in the discussion. "Then what is a huge profit business? Selling weapons? Smuggling? Selling contraband? Or monopoly?" Keyes spoke seriously about the business of the scale of perpetual order. "And there are two kinds of monopolies: resource monopolies and technology monopolies. The enchanted condensing cauldron in the Wasp Mushroom Tower is the best example. As long as he wants to increase the productivity of his workshop and add any new production materials, he can only buy them from a chamber of commerce that has the advanced production technology. I can guarantee that the money he spent to buy the condensing cauldron must have returned the extra price difference he earned through the channels of the Chamber of Commerce over the years." When Harriman heard this, he could not help but find it funny. Then is he still a big wine merchant, a big boss? Isn't he just a worker? Keyes did not comment. The boss of a chamber of commerce who made a fortune in silence was putting on airs. Walking out of the small town and heading west, the road under their feet became more and more barren. Weeds grew wildly on the land where wood and firewood were mined for the construction of the town. Although new trees and shrubs had sprouted, there were no signs of animal activity. In the eyes of Hallimond and his men, there were only wild grasses that grew unrestrained by nature. Although the trees took advantage of the gaps to plant seeds, they were unable to form a new forest. An entire generation passed, but the wastelands still couldn't take this place away. The whole place was silent except for the muffled sound of rocks rolling down. Finally, they came to a forest that had not yet been cut down. A stream flowed around the woodland, providing a shortcut for Harriman and the others on their journey. However, there were no traces of pedestrians here, and the forest became denser and darker. "Living off the mountain," Hallimond commented. "This forest is not far from the small town, and no one comes here to cut wood or hunt. This is not normal." Keyes thought for a while and said, "When we came out of the town, I heard people talking about us. They said that if we were to go to the forest where tundra trolls and owl bears roam, we would either be too daring, or we would be seeking our own deaths." "How is that possible?" the dwarf Grindel continued. "The tundra trolls might be able to survive here, but when they are hungry, they can even eat tree bark. Owl bears are not that easy to raise. If they want to grow up smoothly, they need to eat large amounts of animal organs when they are young. When they grow up, they also need to eat large amounts of meat. After walking for half a day, we didn't even see a deer. How can owl bears survive?" Even though he was a subterranean digger, Grindel had plenty of experience in the wilderness. His understanding of the wastelands and forests was not much less than that of the underground world. Therefore, what he said was indeed very referential. What no one expected was that the answer to this question was quickly revealed by the forest itself. About an hourglass after they walked into the forest, first Keyes, and then the dwarf who was sensitive to vibrations in the ground, noticed something huge approaching. Hallimond took out the lurker again and sprinkled this odorless and tasteless alchemy potion around them, marking out an area of a few yards that was easy to overlook. At the same time, the dwarf did not immediately reach for his battle axe. Instead, Grindel quickly squatted down and swept away the fallen leaves on the ground, pressing his palms tightly against the ground. A pale yellow halo flashed around his body, and a small bulge suddenly appeared on the originally flat terrain, wrapping all of them up. Suddenly being buried in a grave, Hallimond and the two horses led by Old Weather panicked. Fortunately, when Keyes saw this, he immediately took out a few pieces of fruit candy and fed them to Radish and the old horse, calming them down and preventing them from neighing loudly. "Don't speak. The earth tells me that something dangerous is moving towards us." After creating the shelter, the dwarf whispered to everyone. To be honest, this was the first time Hallimond had seen him speak so softly. There was an observation hole in the shelter, and soon they were able to see what was approaching from the hole. It seemed to be a withered tree that had lost all its leaves. However, it was like a spider, using its sturdy and sharp roots to crawl on the ground of the forest. At the cracks on the bark, one could vaguely see flashes of red lightning. At the place where the tree crown should have been, there were dried corpses. There were wild animals such as wild deer, wild boar, and wild wolves. There were also some half-magical beasts, such as owl bears of different sizes and ages. In the center of the tree crown, there was even a tundra troll. These corpses were pierced by the sharp branches of the withered tree, and there were large amounts of burn marks on the surface of the corpses. Considering that these hanging corpses did not have a rotten smell, it was very likely that the insides of the corpses had been carbonized on a large scale. In other words, these things were very likely to have been processed by continuous strong electric current. Roasting them with fire would not be able to achieve such an effect. Is this a demon tree? Or some kind of demon tree? Hallimond looked at the monster striding towards them and asked his companions in a low voice. Although he had learned a course on distinguishing evil creatures from other planes when he was studying at Lord's Landing University, how could a few books record all the different types of demons that were almost impossible to count? He also did not know what this withered tree-like monster was. That's a Sard Dryad. As expected, only Keyes could see the ins and outs of this thing. Or to be more precise, it's a distorted abyssal species called the Sard Dryad. The Sard Dryad originally referred to a specific legendary monster. It was an ancient tree that was infused with lightning energy and primeval life by a strange god in the world of the fairies. Legend had it that the original Sard Dryad's sap was red liquefied lightning. Later, as the world of the fairies broke apart, the original Sard Dryad was nowhere to be found. At present, the Sard Dryads that had appeared and been confirmed in the multiverse were all monsters that were separated from the original Sard Dryad and cultivated by humans. Therefore, the Sard Dryad became the name of a monster, and was not exclusive to the legendary tree spirit named Sard. These Sard Dryads could disguise themselves as withered old trees, especially when they used their spell-like ability in the form of trees. They really looked no different from withered trees. Only when they moved, the flashing lightning between the cracks of the Sard Dryad's skin would reveal their unusualness. Although they had huge and clumsy bodies, the Sard Dryads were actually very agile and fast. They could use their spider leg-like fibrous roots to quickly sweep across the ground like giant insects. In battle, they would either use their huge trunks to slap the enemy, or launch wave after wave of poisonous thorns with electric sap. And when the Sard Dryad died, its body would explode with lightning, sputtering out countless sharp wooden thorns. The Sard Dryads were almost as smart as humans, but unlike the Ents, they did not intend to use this intelligence to do something constructive. In fact, the original Sard Dryad was created as a living siege tool. They were satisfied with this role, and often systematically searched for fortresses and towns to destroy. This was completely a nature of the Sard Dryads. Yes, they, like most fairies, belonged to the camp of chaos. And because of their potential, how could the demons, as messengers of chaos and evil, ignore the Sard Dryads, a species with a desire for chaos and destruction? Many years ago, the demons had transplanted a batch of Sard Dryads into the bottomless abyss, allowing the power of the abyss to corrode them, creating a subspecies of Sard Dryads of the abyss. And what Harriman's group saw was precisely this kind of monster. This thing isn't a pure demon, Keyes explained. Although the Sard Dryads of the abyss aren't that rare, to be able to grow to this scale, it is estimated that they have been nurtured with blood many times. A demon without strength can't afford to nurture a Sard Dryad. In other words, the demon that released it is a rather rich one in the bottomless abyss, and might even be a demon noble. And a demon lord? Hearing Keyes' analysis, Harriman could not help but be surprised. If a demon lord really came to the material plane, even if it was just a projection, their best choice now was to turn around and leave. Then, no matter what method they used to pass this information to the scale of perpetual order, they could only obediently wait for the Chamber of Commerce to give them a reward. Not to that extent, at most it's a descendant of a certain demon lord, Keyes said rather confidently. How could there be such a shameless demon lord? Why would those fellows need to hide after coming to the material plane? If they did not cause a huge commotion, wouldn't the title of demon lord be a waste? Chapter 1130. Keyes spoke with certainty, because he was the one who caused this demon to wreak havoc on Tapped Island. To be more precise, he was the main culprit who caused Ozus, the son of the demon lord, to be unable to return to the bottomless abyss and trapped in the body of a half-demon monster. Of course, as a member of the Order faction, Keyes did not do this on a whim. Keyes had two goals. First, to show how hospitable he was, he did not intend to let the son of his old friend, Six-Fingered, leave. If possible, Keyes even hoped that Ozus would invite Graz ZT over so that he could fully fulfill his role as a host. Second, the war between the soft maple, Yomusi, and Tapped Island was an internal conflict in the Ramsey Plain in Key's eyes. He needed to establish the image of an external enemy so that he could appease the three parties when the war ended. However, no matter how hospitable Keyes was, he would not allow the demon calamity to happen in a plane under his control. Since Ozus did not have the self-awareness of being a tool demon and dared to cultivate sod dryads to corrupt Tapped Island, Keyes would not continue to indulge him. Sod dryads of the abyss are not afraid of lightning or fire, but they are easily injured when attacked by sound waves. Apart from using firearms and crossbows to completely destroy them from a distance, attacking them at close range is definitely a terrible idea. While describing the characteristics of the fallen dryads, Keyes also dispelled Grinder's plans to take the lead and launch an ambush on the monsters. Although you are wearing a thick enough plate armor that can block the splashing of the wooden thorns, every attack of the sod dryads is accompanied by electric shock. If you don't want to be charred on the outside by the magical lightning carried by the wooden thorns, I don't recommend that you charge forward. Even if Grinder did not want to believe Key's constructive advice, he still firmly believed that the armor made by the dwarven master craftsman was a solid fortress. However, in order to be able to drink the dwarven beer in the future, he compromised. Moreover, although Keyes did not recommend them to charge at the sod dryads, he did not say that they would let the monsters go. There is actually a better way to deal with them. Keyes was confident. He was playing the role of Hugh Hood, a gunslinger hunter who was good at dealing with all kinds of monsters. Plant them back in the ground. Sod dryads are not ants. They can't be rooted in the ground like normal trees because they can't get the nutrients they need to survive. Otherwise, it wouldn't need to have so many prey hanging on its body. You can think of it as a kind of spider that will tie up its prey like a fly and then slowly absorb the juices in its prey. Harriman was very appreciative of this method. It was a battle of wits and not strength. This was what experienced hunters would do. But he still raised a question. I mean, once we control them, do we just wait for them to slowly starve to death? Of course not. Keyes shook his finger and patted the spear behind him. When that guy becomes a stationary target, its first reaction will be to struggle and release electricity. But it can't release unlimited lightning. As long as we keep teasing it, with the low intelligence of the sod dryads, it won't take long for it to empty all of its stored electrical charges. At that time, Keyes waved his hand and made a slashing motion. We'll treat it as firewood and chop it into pieces. After the plan was formulated, the next step was to implement it. Fortunately, even if it had spider legs and could move on the ground, the sod dryad's movement speed was not fast. While Keyes and the others were discussing the strategy, the moving withered tree was only about 100 steps closer. The sod dryads were now about 200 steps away from the small mound where they were hiding, and this was the best distance for the gunner profession to display their combat strength. Keyes rolled and drilled out of a hole in the cave. He was as agile as a loach. Using the cover of the trees, he held the spear with one arm, knelt on one knee, and aimed at the moving sod dryads. Bang! Following this gunshot, the smokeless gunpowder exploded, and the lead-coated copper-tipped bullet instantly shot out, hitting the staggering monster from afar. Because his aim was very accurate, Quest's shot just happened to hit a branch on the treetop of the sard tree. Gotcha! The tree branch seemed to have been chopped by a sharp axe, and was directly split into two from the middle. The carcass of a wild deer hanging on the branch also drooped down and hung next to the sod dryad's giant eyeball. Suddenly attacked, it first scattered a wave of wooden thorns carrying lightning in all directions in horror, and then this abyssal monster became furious. Its blood-red eyes quickly locked onto the target that was rapidly moving in the forest in the distance. It stepped out of those claw-like roots and rushed toward Keyes as if it had been injected with stimulant. Because it was walking in a straight line, as it walked, the branches that grew horizontally also whipped the big trees, blocking its path like arms. For a time, the trees were broken in the middle. The Ents, who also looked like giant trees, but who took the forest as their responsibility, would never do this. He didn't know if the spirit gods who created the sod dryads would regret it. Every 10 steps Keys ran, he would turn back and pull the trigger at the sod dryad. His shooting was very accurate, like the most brilliant gunner, and almost every bullet would break a branch of the monster. And on those branches, the sod tree spirit's reserves were all hanging. When it was in intense movement or attacking, it would consume a lot of energy. Originally, with those food reserves, it could still draw some nutrients from them. But with Keys doing this, the sod dryad's self-control was greatly reduced. However, the enraged monster didn't realize this, and it still tried to move with all its might in an attempt to catch up to Keys. Under such intense movement, the few beast carcasses hanging on its treetop quickly shriveled, turning into a thin layer of paper. As it kept moving, those hard paper kept colliding with each other, producing a sound like castanet. After running for about half an hour, Keys had already led the sod dryads in a circle that was about a mile long. They ran for half a day and finally reached the starting point, where Hammond and the others had already set up a trap. Seeing the mound built by the dwarven diggers, Keys tapped his feet on the ground and quickly jumped over it. The sod dryads behind him obviously didn't have such jumping ability, and the monster's spider-like legs stepped on the ground, completely ignoring the unremarkable mound. And it was this carelessness that would make it regret it for the rest of its life, if the next half an hourglass counted as a lifetime. With a muffled sound, the sod dryad crushed the soil layer on the surface of the small mound and fell into the mud pit summoned by the dwarven underground diggers with their professional ability. It struggled for a long time before adjusting its angle, and wanted to climb out of the mud pit. During this period of time, the runes that Grindel had written in the dwarven language began to take effect. A spell similar to mud to stone caused the volcanic ash, lime, and water in the mud pit to quickly solidify into a large man-made rock. Half of the sod dryad's body was covered by this rock, and only the upper half of its trunk and many of its tree crown-like branches could still move. In its panic, this unintelligent monster continuously slapped at the rock, but at most, it could only smash out some stone fragments, which were of no help to the huge rock embedded in the ground. When the trap took effect, Keys, who was hiding behind a large tree in the forest, revealed himself, and aimed at the sod dryad's trunk and started shooting. Wood fragments flew everywhere, and lightning flashed everywhere. This dryad that had been corrupted by the bottomless abyss was like a trapped beast, making its final struggle. But no matter how it struggled, its fate had already been fixed the moment it stepped into the trap. When Quest's last shot blew up the big eyeball on the trunk of the sod treant, the monster's body exploded with blazing lightning in an instant, turning into countless sharp wooden thorns. In the forest, the smell of ionized vegetation permeated the air. Chapter 1131. While Keys, Harriman, Grinder the dwarf, and Old Weather were in the middle of Tapt, the alliance that the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army had been waiting for arrived. The allied army formed by the Yomians, the Camels, and the Walrus crossed the northern half of Tapt Island, conquering the land there and plundering the towns there. Finally, they reached the Shane River where the 10 Pearl Towns were located. Beside the river that divided the north and south of Tapt, the supreme commander of the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army, the acting speaker of the council, and the leader of the Yomians, the legendary pirate King Naaman, who was the first to pledge his loyalty to the scale of perpetual order, shared a cup of honey wine with the blood of livestock. They crossed their hands and held each other's wrists tightly, allowing the spellcaster to form a legally binding and spellbinding contract for them. Flames ignited on their arms at the same time, but neither of them retracted their arms. Of course, the flames summoned by the spellbinding contract did not harm them. They only left symmetrical black vine-like tattoos on their arms. Finally, the two signed a contract in triplicate. Each of them would keep one copy, and the other would be kept by the Justice Center under the scale of perpetual order in Lord's Landing City in the Ramsey Plain. Since then, the agreement between the two sides had been legally concluded. Any action that violated the spirit of the contract within the time limit of the contract would be regarded as a betrayal of the contract. As the representatives of the contract, not only would Grisus and Naaman suffer from the backlash of the spell, but the interest groups they represented would also have their credit rating lowered in the rating system of the scale of perpetual order. As the saying went, the fastest way to create wealth is to build an empire, but the fastest way is to destroy an empire. The soft maple people and Yomians had crossed the ocean to Tapped Island under the banner of punishing the descendants of the families that had once acted as agents of Dwarf Island for oppressing Ramsay. However, anyone with a brain would know that these two forces were here to plunder wealth. Therefore, not long after the end of the alliance meeting, the two armies continued their journey to the south after a little rest and replenishment of supplies. As they had received reports of the mechanized troops sent by the southern kingdom of Tapt, and learned that the army formed by King Vixith had wiped out the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army, the commander of the allied army did not wish to fight them in the wild. We have to rely on the city's defense system. Otherwise, our young men will have to use their flesh and blood to fight against those steel cans. Grisus was worried that the Yomians were used to fighting in the north of Tapped Island and would underestimate Tapp's military strength, so he took the initiative to express his opinion in the meeting. However, what surprised him was that Naaman, the commander of the Yomians, actually listened to him. The rugged Yamian legendary pirate with graying sideburns stroked the military map on the table and bluntly agreed with Grisus' opinion. I agree with Mayor Grisus' opinion. This was an era where offense trumps defense in terms of tactics, and defense trumps offense in terms of strategy. If the enemy's firearms and equipment were as ferocious as reported in the war report, then it would be the stupidest way to fight them. On the contrary, relying on the city's defense system, relying on the prismatic defense system formed by the thick city walls, the half-moon fortress, and the triangular fortress, coupled with sufficient air defense to continuously consume the enemy's mechanized troop supplies, and even let the pressure from the logistics directly wear down the enemy. This is the best response we can find now. Naaman, the legendary pirate king, had clearly expressed his support for Grisus' opinion and reached a consensus on the strategy, regardless of whether he had not been blinded by the previous victory or just wanted to take care of the feelings of his allies in the early stages of the alliance meeting. At the same time, he also put forward his own opinion on the tactical aspect. Although we have already occupied the 10 Pearl Towns, and the Cheyenne River is a very good defensive barrier, it is still not enough to resist the attack of a mechanized army. If we build a bastion defense system here, the amount of work will be too large. Our army will be exhausted before the enemy attacks. I suggest that the Alliance should take the initiative to attack and quickly occupy Valensburg in the south. According to the intelligence, County Governor Macius, who was originally in charge of guarding there, suddenly died a few days ago, and the city's defense was taken over by the modified Oliveira Legion under the pseudo-King Vixus. Presumably, during this period of time, there is still a gap between the old and new forces. We can use this opportunity to send spies or use other means to seize Valensburg. It is a city with a perfect city defense system, and it has a large amount of supplies stored. With a little construction, it can be used as a bridgehead to wear down the mechanized army. What's more, Valensburg was one of the 6 major cities overseen by the lords of the southern Tapped country. Whether it is from a political perspective or for the wealth it contains, I believe that the pseudo-King Vixus will not turn a blind eye to it. His impeccable logic and feasible plan allowed Naaman to quickly gain the approval of many soft maple lords, led by Grisus. His opinion quickly turned into practical action. The 10 Pearl Towns only left behind the Alliance's injured soldiers and 3 vanguard legions that had fought in turns. There were a total of 4,000 people, and they were to recuperate and maintain the local rule. The Yomians who had plundered all the way from the north had generously left behind a portion of the food and gunpowder they had seized for the garrison. The rest of the main forces quickly set off and charged toward Valensburg. The Soft Maple Expeditionary Army arranged for another 5,000 men to be the vanguard legion, and the Yomians also sent out 5,000 men. The two forces combined. However, the commander of the Yomians, Naaman, did not allow the Camel people and Walrus people, who had a racial advantage and stronger individual combat strength, to participate in this first alliance legion of 10,000 men. The explanation he gave was that the first army would be the first to enter the city, and it would be best if they all had human faces to avoid unnecessary trouble. After 2 days of rushing, the First Alliance's army was about to reach Valensburg. Grisus and the other Soft Maple lords finally understood why Naaman was so confident that the First Army could easily break through the city walls. On the last night before the start of the siege, they received 2 guests in their tent. In the darkness of the night, the huge tent sewn from goat leather was brightly lit. All the commanders of the First Alliance Legion sat on their respective stools, forming a semicircle. On the thick carpet woven from wool in front of them were 2 velvet armchairs in the style of tap. 2 men in grayish-brown hooded cloaks were sitting on the 2 chairs. Elder André, Mr. Schladiger, son of Magistrate Messias, as a hospitable Yomusi and a dear ally of the Soft Maple, I welcome you, Naaman said to the 2 guests who had come to visit. At the same time, his words made all the Soft Maple commanders and Yomians aware of the true identities of these 2 guests. Chapter 1132. Looking at the 2 guests, all the lords of the Soft Maple people felt that it was unreal. Although they were bound by the contract, they believed that Naaman had no reason to lie to them. However, it was the first time in their lives that a prominent figure from the enemy's city appeared in their own camp before the siege began to join in the grand undertaking. Just as Naaman had introduced, the 2 guests were wearing hooded cloaks to hide their identities. One of them was the former deacon of the Druid conclave in Valensburg and was now an elder. The other was the oldest son of the late ruler of Valensburg. It could be said that the 2 of them were the second and third most powerful figures in this land other than the 2 modified Alaveras, who were temporarily in charge of the military and political affairs. Taking into account the geographical factors, as well as the deep roots of the Druid Guild and the Messias family in Valensburg, the 2 of them should have a much greater influence than the 2 Alaveras modified humans. It was reasonable to say that for such a person, even the 2 temporary county governors, number 24 and number 27, were inconvenient to manage due to the influence of various parties. Before the war broke out, they would definitely send more people to watch over them. For the 2 of them to be able to walk out of the city and arrive at the enemy's camp unscathed, it was most likely that someone very powerful had helped them. Sure enough, as soon as the 2 of them sat down, they took the initiative to offer compliments and thanks to Naaman who had provided them with help. After Naaman had someone serve them some sweet beer to quench their thirst, the host and guest gave a toast to each other. To the proudest allied legion, to the most honorable protector of Valensburg, and so on and so forth. Of course, it took skill to choose the right words to say. For example, Prince Schladiger's words of the rightful protector of Valensburg were exactly what he wanted to hear. After the latter heard it, he immediately showed an expression of pride. He pulled down his hood and downed the beer in his cup in one gulp. Then, he wiped the foam around his mouth with the back of his hand. On the other hand, Elder André, who represented the authority of the Druid Church in the city, was much calmer. He only took a sip of his wine as a token gesture. Perhaps it was due to the self-discipline of a spellcaster, or perhaps it was because he was worried that the alcohol would affect the bargaining in the upcoming negotiations, so he always maintained a vigilant attitude. In fact, under his robe where no one could see, Elder André even carried 2 miniature reliefs unique to the Druid conclave. If the situation changed, He could release the reliefs at any time to cover his retreat and quickly escape the camp. After a few drinks, Naaman threw the empty cup to the guard and sat up straight to look at the two guests. "My promise is the same as before. Now, all the soft maple lords can bear witness to it." Naaman did not beat around the bush. Lord Schladiger can inherit his father's authority and become the actual ruler of the Valensburg area. He does not need to be loyal to the false King Vixis. As for Elder Andre, I support you to become the leader of the northern faction of the Druid Conclave. The newly established conclave can move freely in the northern part of Tap. In our occupied area, your conclave will enjoy all the corresponding rights and interests of the conclave supported by the false King Vixis. After that, he paused again, not giving the two a chance to continue bargaining. There are only two conditions of equal value that we want. First, the safe passage into Valensburg. At least 3,000 men must enter the city tonight. Elder Andre, you must ensure that the city's Druid Order's defense system is firmly locked down and cannot be used by the two Elavras. Second, after the battle between our men and the city's garrison begins, Lord Schladik must instigate the commanders who are loyal to you so that they will no longer be under the command of the acting sheriff. At the same time, you must also take on the responsibility of comforting the citizens of the city. Second, after the battle between our men and the city's garrison begins, Lord Schladik must instigate the commanders who are loyal to you so that they will not be under the command of the acting sheriff. At most, we will withdraw in a month. After Naaman spoke, a guard immediately presented two pre-written contracts and handed them to Schladiger and Andre. Since the two of them came to the camp in the middle of the night, Naaman had approved. In fact, they were 99% willing to reach an agreement. Sure enough, after a short negotiation, Andre and Schladiger's names were signed on the contract. This was a legal guarantee for future profits, as well as a proof of their allegiance to the First Legion of the Alliance. With willing and high-ranking guides, the rest of the matters proceeded without a hitch. The 3,000 men that had been arranged beforehand left the camp in the middle of the night. Apart from the sentries guarding the camp, even the other 1,000 men of the First Legion didn't know about the departure of these three friendly forces. The accompanying mages contributed greatly in this process. They used magic to block out the sounds that would inevitably be made when the troops were moving. At the same time, they gave all the officers temporary night vision abilities to make it easier for them to lead troops in a night raid. The 3,000-man squads marched silently to a mountain peak to the east of Valensburg. A grand funeral had been held on this mountain peak a few days ago. Sheriff Messias's family mausoleum was located on a cliff on this mountain peak. As Messias's eldest son, Schladiger, who was already an adult, knew many family secrets that his younger siblings did not know. When the city was first built, it was still Messias's father and Schladiger's grandfather who owned this land. The old lord, who was known as Cunning Fox by his acquaintances, was worried that his descendants would be besieged. Thus, before the city was built, he had worked hard to cooperate with several mages to dig out an underground tunnel when the city was first built. In order to protect this secret, the old lord first forced the mages to swear a magical oath, then poisoned all the slaves who participated in the construction of the tunnel. Not only that, he also set the exit of the tunnel near the family mausoleum. Every month, he would send people to the mausoleum, in the name of patrolling, to eliminate any civilians who might know of the secret. In addition, the old lord had established the family's funeral custom of thin coffins and simple burials, and he took the lead in enforcing it. Everyone in Valensburg knew that there were no treasures in the mausoleum of the lord's family, and if they offended the lord's eternal rest, they might be caught and hanged. As such, no one dared to approach this mountain peak. Thus, the secret of the tunnel was only passed down within the lord's family. Cunning Fox passed it down to Messias, and Messias told Schladiger. And today, this custom, which had lasted for 3 generations, was finally broken. Schladiger personally led the 3,000 men of the 1st Legion of the Alliance army to offend the resting place of their ancestors, and walked into the underground tunnel that was wide enough for 2 to 3 people, and could even allow a single rider to gallop. The end of this tunnel led directly to the mansion of the Messias family. However, the 3,000 men of the vanguard did not have to go that far. There were a few important military command buildings in the city that had branches of the tunnel hidden in them. Schladiger led the 3,000 men to the main camp of the city guards near the city gate, the warehouse of the city's military supplies, and the stronghold of the merchant guild near the water gate. During this time, Elder André, who had been accompanying him, had been fiddling with a stone disc-shaped, concentric circle lock. As he replaced the last 2 concentric circles, the 7 or 8 sets of inscriptions on the concentric circles formed a complete inscription, and the secret key of the city's Druid conclave to control the city's special defense system was completed. He inserted a round stone rod into the gap in the middle of the concentric circles, locking the disc in place. "It's done." André wiped the sweat off his forehead. Although the underground tunnel was terrifyingly cold, it still took him a lot of effort to carefully piece together the secret key. When he was ready, the army mage beside him immediately passed the message to the commander of the 3,000 men. Then, the 3 legions that had been sharpening their swords quickly rushed out of the tunnel and attacked the important military buildings in the city. They were also the command center of the city's defense. Presumably, the cunning fox lord would never have dreamed that the branch tunnel that he had dug out because he was worried that he would not be able to retreat to the mansion when defending the city would be used like this today. The 3,000 men were actually not much different in number compared to the 4,000 guards in the city. Moreover, the places where the battle broke out were the important command center buildings in the city. Not only were the guards unable to use their forces, but they also did not have enough heavy firepower to attack. Soon, the warehouse of the military supplies and the stronghold of the merchant guild were taken by the 2,000 men of the 1st Legion of the Alliance army. Only the main camp of the city guards was still resisting. However, the resistance of the camp did not last for long. When Schladig appeared in front of the 2 armies, the commander of the charging Wolf Knights, who was previously incorporated into the city guards as a field officer, walked out of the camp with the captive and tied-up commander of the city guards. The entire city guards immediately gave up resisting. Not long after, the city gates of Valensburg were opened, and the city walls were lit with fire. When the sun rose, the remaining soldiers of the 1st Legion of the Alliance army, who had been woken up in the middle of the night to prepare, marched into Valensburg and officially took over the defense of the city. In the entire city, only the mansion of the Messias family and the fortress that was temporarily commandeered by the 2 modified prefectures of Alavra's army had not been taken. However, as the leader of the Yomians, Naman dispelled Grice's plan to get rid of this nail. "Instead of bleeding, why don't we wait? We will be leaving this place in a month's time. Do we really want to waste our manpower on the battle for the inheritance of Lord Schladig? He already has nearly 4,000 guards. Give him 1,000 men to attack his ancestral mansion, and it will be enough for him to cause trouble for a while. The rest will be sent to build the triangular fortress. We don't have much time left." Chapter 1133. The chilly wind blew. Although the autumn wind had blown away most of the smoke and gunpowder from last night, the smell of iron and blood still lingered in Valensburg. No one dared to walk casually on the street. Even the market, which used to be bustling with noise, had become deserted today. Schladig rode on a red horse and gathered a large group of city guards who had brought order to the square. They surrounded his family's mansion so tightly that not even a drop of water could pass through. Apart from his own immediate family, the descendants of the old sheriff, Messias, and his brothers and sisters were still in the small fortress. In other words, they were all captives of the Alavra Legion. But Schladig did not care about that at all. Wells, aqueducts, underground pipes. Block all the channels related to water that you can find. The county governor, who had just taken office last night, ordered a colonel of the city guards under his command. The lieutenant colonel was none other than the former commander of the Charging Wolf Knights. He was also the person who helped Schladig and the First Legion of the Alliance take down the city guards' camp. Yes, sir. On top of that, Schladiger pondered for a moment before continuing, but his voice was very low. Order all the wolf cubs under your command to come and get 1 pound of silver coins from me after we've breached this house. The captain will get double the reward and you'll get 50 pounds. You have been with the old man for the longest time, so you know how full his treasury is. You are now military police, so don't take the lead and do those taboo things. Hearing the high reward, the commander of the Charging Wolf Knights could not help but perk up. Please don't worry, I will definitely talk to the pups properly. Since you have given them such a generous reward, they will naturally not risk their lives. It is not worth it. As he spoke, the regiment commander glanced into the distance, intentionally or unintentionally. In front of Macius' mansion, there was originally a small square. At this time, there were 70 to 80 long poles erected around the small square. On each pole hung a hideous corpse. Among these people, there were more than 20 people from the First Legion. These people did not fight well last night. Instead, they were passionate about raping and pillaging. In the end, they were sentenced to death by the military judge. Some other people, including the defeated soldiers of the city guards and the city gangsters who wanted to take advantage of the situation, were also caught and strangled to death. Both Naumann and Grisus expressed their support for the reorganization of military discipline, and some lords who wanted to plead for their relatives were whipped instead. They had to prepare for the upcoming siege and mobilize the citizens of Wallingsburg when necessary. Therefore, they couldn't allow the city to fall into chaos. It's good that you can tell the difference. Schladig nodded with satisfaction. Let the engineers of the garrison work. Lift the bricks in the square, dig the Z-shaped trench, build the parapet, and push it to the edge of the mansion. Don't worry, the Druid Guild has promised me that the spell tower in the mansion has been locked down. It's precisely because there are still a few cannons that I don't want you guys to force your way in. Just seal off this place, and we'll be able to trap the 2 modified humans. As the eldest son of Macius, Schladig was also a military noble. Therefore, although he had never led an army into battle, he had received professional education since he was a child. When he set up the siege strategy, there were no mistakes, and he was able to grasp the key point of the siege. Remember, you must ensure that the guards on that side don't walk out of the walls. Since they could communicate with the outside world, it meant that the fortress was not completely surrounded. This strategy itself had failed by at least a third. When the siege in the center of Wallingsburg began, the joint army of the Soft Maple and Yomians, who had taken control of the city, was also preparing for a larger siege. However, they were the ones besieging the enemy inside the city, while the enemy besieged them outside the city. On the second day after the First Legion took over Wallingsburg, the remaining 20,000 people of the joint army finally arrived at the city with their supplies. Just as Naumann had expected, when the reinforcements entered the city, the camel and walrus mercenaries that belonged to the Yomians still caused a small number of the city's residents to panic. Camel and walrus were intelligent creatures that resembled humans, but the difference in their appearances aside, just the fact that they were so large that adult humans looked no different from children was enough to cause fear in the hearts of ordinary people. After all, gigantism was an instinctive reaction of most creatures to avoid harm. Fortunately, the discipline of these mercenaries seemed to be better than that of the Yomians' pirate army. Their attitude towards war was to work for money. Without money, they would not risk their lives for the Yomians, but if they were paid enough, they would be the best soldiers. However, the impact of the invasion of the city did not last long. The people of Wallingsburg were distracted by other things. Money. The lords are giving out money. The next day after all the legions of the Allied army entered the city, The children in the streets and alleys were spreading a piece of news that interested everyone. The new army that had occupied the city was recruiting people to work and would also give out 2 silver coins as a daily salary. The residents of the city were not like the residents of the villages and towns. They rarely stockpiled food. They worked every day to earn their wages and then used their wages to buy food. During times of prosperity, the citizens of the city would live better than the farmers. They could use a portion of their wages to cover their daily expenses, and the rest could be saved as primitive accumulation or savings. However, not all citizens of the city had enough savings. During times of war or unrest, trade and industry would shrink, and the price of goods would rise. The citizens of the city would have little money to spare, and many of them would gradually become poor. To put it bluntly, a large number of people in the city were short of money. If they didn't earn enough money, then their families would have to starve or even drink the northwest wind. Although the Yomians and the Yomians were here to get rich, their commanders were not short-sighted fools. At the very least, Grisus and Naaman, who were able to make decisions, were smart people. They stood their ground and took out some of the money that the army had systematically plundered. To be more specific, they took out the silver coins they had taken from the various guilds near the Watergate as wages for the mercenaries. The purchasing power of 1 silver coin was still very strong. Therefore, before the wages were paid, they had to be cut into 13 pieces, which were commonly known as silver coins. This money was specifically used to pay wages for the army to recruit people to build defensive structures outside the city. Just like how Schladiger had attacked the Messias mansion, the Allied army had mobilized tens of thousands of citizens to strengthen the defensive trenches around Wallingsburg. At the same time, outside of the half-moon fortresses at the corners of the city walls, the workers were still working overtime under the command of the engineers. They used the earth from the trenches to build triangular fortresses outside the city gates of Valens Castle. It was unrealistic to turn the entire city into a huge star-shaped fortress, but the triangular fortresses could achieve a similar effect. These triangular fortresses did not need to be too tall. 12 feet was enough. Any taller and they would easily block the sight of the enemy on the walls. Every triangular fortress was connected to the city walls by a drawbridge. The defenders could use these drawbridges to travel between the fortress and the city walls. As for their uses, there were 3 main reasons. First, the triangular fortresses were located in front of the city gate. The enemy could not directly attack the weak point of the city's defense system. Secondly, although each of the triangular fortresses was not tall, they were built with thick earth blocks. Compared to ordinary stone city walls, they could withstand more damage from cannons. Plus, people had long realized that firing cannons on the stone walls would cause more damage to the city walls than the enemy's cannon fire. Therefore, most of the time, the city walls could only be equipped with some less powerful cannons and anti-air cannons. On the other hand, on the sturdier triangular fortresses made of earth, it was more suitable to install heavy cannons. Third, the 2 fronts of the triangular fortresses could form a crossfire zone with the fortresses at the corners of the city walls. Any enemy that wanted to attack the city walls would have to walk through this corridor of death. Even if the enemy commander rationally chose to use the trenches and slowly approach the city walls or the triangular fortresses through the trenches, not to mention the fact that the defenders would not let the enemy succeed so easily, just the amount of time and resources wasted would definitely be a terrifying number. Other than these conventional arrangements, the Allied army also made some additional preparations based on the information they received. For example, to prevent the enemy from being forced into a corner, they would use the steam tanks used in the field to attack, close to the city walls, and use them as cannons. The Allied army also recruited some professional masons with higher salaries and asked the engineers to lead them to build some anti-tank cones with plaster, mortar, and masonry near the triangular fortresses. Of course, only some of these anti-tank cones were added with special alchemy products that were strong enough to counter the tracks. the rest were used to deceive the enemy. For example, in order to prevent the enemy from sending out flying troops to bomb or attack important targets, the Allied army not only spent a lot of money to set up anti-air guns and cannons at some important locations on the city walls, but also dug out tomb-like buildings outside the city and buried many unknown things in those tombs at night. Of course, the burying process would not be left to the civilians. Firstly, it was to prevent them from leaking secrets. Secondly, they were worried that they would be afraid and affect the construction progress. Chapter 1134. The night was long and there seemed to be no end in sight. The water supply in the Messias family's mansion had been cut off for 2 days. Although there was still a reservoir for drinking water, everyone couldn't help but feel very anxious. Many people were whispering to each other, wondering when these days of being besieged would come to an end. The answers given by numbers 27 and 34 were accurate. It would take at most 10 days and at least 5 days. As long as King Vixitha's army reached Valensburg, the situation would quickly be reversed, and they would be able to break free from their encirclement. The officers of the city garrison that the two Alavras had roped in, as well as the small number of soldiers led by the latter, were relatively easy to fool. They respected their commanding officer's strength, and were confident in the sturdiness of the Messias manor. The ones who were pessimistic were the representatives of the various guilds. After the Watergate Guild Union was taken over by the 1st Legion, these people rushed out of the encirclement under the lead of their bodyguards and family guards. In the end, they could only listen to the orders of the two Alavras who had promised to protect them and obediently lead their men to defend the Messias manor. The guild representatives were all the best of the best. They had no choice but to follow numbers 27 and 34 wholeheartedly. It wasn't that no one had thought of surrendering to the invaders, but the Messians and Yomians had no intention of doing so. They even took the initiative to kill the wealthy merchants. At this point, no matter how spineless the guild representatives were, they knew in their hearts that the Messians and Yomians had their eyes on their wealth, and wanted to squeeze them dry in one go. They had no intention of letting them live as leak. Every time they thought of that and thought of the silver coins in their safes being stolen by those people, the merchants felt as if their hearts were being clenched tightly. That was why they couldn't help but vent their anger on the family of the old magistrate Messias. It was because of Schladig's betrayal that the guild merchants suffered losses. The cursing escalated into violence, and the violence gradually escalated into violence. Moreover, this kind of leveling speed was quite fast. On the 3rd day of the siege, number 34 raised the millstone in front of everyone and crushed the limbs of 3 bodyguards who had attempted to rape an unmarried daughter of Magistrate Messias. He then cut off the heads of the 3 men and forced all the bodyguards of the guild to read it. But even so, that person could not save the life of the noble lady who had committed suicide out of fear of being humiliated. The reason why number 34 used such a cruel method was not because of a sense of honor. Elavra's honor was only because of his loyalty to King Vixis. He did this for 2 reasons. First, to eliminate any signs of chaos. Second, even if Messias's eldest son, Schladiger, betrayed Wallingsburg, Messias's family was still a feudal class. Only King Vixens had the right to punish them. If the bodyguards of the guilds were allowed to do as they pleased, even if they were valuable defensive forces in the siege, in the long run, it would undoubtedly be digging into the corner of the kingdom's rule. When the people in this mansion were rescued alive from the siege, the matter of the lower class defeating the upper class would most likely be spread out. The actions of those rebellious bodyguards would then become an extremely bad example of a case study. That was why number 34 had executed them so cruelly. However, getting rid of this hidden danger didn't make number 34 feel any better. During a routine discussion with his partner, number 27, he spoke of his worries without holding back. The morale is terrible. Perhaps we can still hold on. The garrison soldiers who are used to following orders can also hold on. But the armed personnel of the various guilds, while they can fight a smooth battle, being besieged for 3 days is already enough to break their nerves. Therefore, tonight, number 34 led a dozen of the guild's bodyguards, whose morale had been boosted by generous rewards, and jumped over the wall under the cover of the night to ambush Schlatteuger's engineers, who were digging the Z-shaped trench. Number 27 did not object to number 34's plan, even if such an operation should not be led by the only 2 commanders. However, firstly, she believed in her partner's strength. Secondly, such a smooth battle could indeed boost morale. Thirdly, slowing down the speed at which the trenches surrounded the mansion and restraining the enemy's tactical intention of nailing them to the wall was indeed quite important. In order to besiege the mansion, Schlatteuger ordered his men to dig 5 trenches with parapets. If the trenches were connected to the walls of the mansion, the attackers would be able to safely transport a large number of men to the walls while being protected. Number 34 did not have many men with him, so it was impossible for him to fill the trenches. What he needed to do was to kill as many precious engineers as possible. Both he and number 27 knew very well that King Vixitha's army was about to reach the city. The soft maple and yamshans must have sent a large number of engineers to the more crucial city defense construction posts. Every single one of the engineers left for Schlatteuger to attack the mansion would be one less. Furthermore, there was another piece of evidence to support their deduction. After 3 days of siege, other than using a few light cannons to bombard the walls of the mansion, Schlatteuger did not set up any trebuchets or heavy cannons to directly attack the mansion. This meant that Schlatteuger did not have a lot of cannons in his hands. They were all sent to more important positions. By analogy, Schlatteuger's engineers were also in short supply. When No. 34 led his men into the first trench, they saw a group of engineers who had just changed shift. This confirmed their previous guess. The more engineers needed to dig the trenches, the better. However, after the change of shifts, each squad only had 4 people. Even if they took into account that this was a shift system, they would only have 8 people. Schlatteuger could only use 40 people to dig 5 trenches. This was enough to show how much he lacked professional soldiers. After killing these 40 people, if that guy wants to keep digging, he will either have to request for more engineers or have his normal soldiers act as engineers. Normal soldiers have not been trained and do not know how to protect themselves during excavation work. Schlatteuger probably wanted to establish his authority and did not want more deaths, so he did not let them work. After tonight, in a flash, number 34 used 2 long daggers to slit the necks of the 4 engineers in one go. As he killed, he still had the energy to think about his battle strategy. However, he still missed one thing. The bodyguards who followed him to see what he could do were far worse than he had imagined. Originally, number 34 had asked everyone to bite on the wooden sticks to prevent them from making any noise that would attract the attention of the attackers. However, after he had finished off the 4 engineers, one of the bodyguards from the dozen or so guilds had actually lost his sense of measure. Some of them tried to get some loot from the bodies of the engineers. Some of them even spat out the wooden sticks in their mouths and made a sound that made number 34 want to curse. Beep, 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 1 long and 2 short whistles, which meant that there was an enemy attack, suddenly sounded from the mouth of a soldier that Schlatteuger had arranged to be a hidden sentry. He hadn't noticed the commotion in the trench at first, but the laughter of the guild's bodyguards had caught his attention. At night, in order to prevent the army from roaring, even the engineers who were working were not allowed to play around. They could only bury their heads in work or rest. The sudden laughter could only mean that a mouse had entered the trenches and that the engineers were most likely dead. Damn it! Number 34 really wanted to kill all the idiots he brought with him. However, considering that he still needed them to go back and spread optimism, he held himself back. Don't waste time. Go to the other trenches and kill as many engineers as you can. Now that there was a change in the plan, Number 34 could only give orders to those idiots who could not do anything right. There was no way to sneak through the trenches one by one. He could only hope that the engineers had not retreated in time when the whistle sounded. He wanted to kill as many as he could before returning to the mansion. It was a pity that he had underestimated the guild's bodyguards' ability to ruin things. Just as No. 34 had single-handedly cleared out 3 more trenches that had yet to retreat, the guild's bodyguards who were in charge of clearing one trench actually ran back to the mansion crying for their parents. It turned out that when they saw Number 34 killing so smoothly, these people also had the thought of, I can do it too. They went down to the trench that was assigned to them and saw the small team of engineers retreating quickly along the trench. They actually used their advantage in numbers to chase after them. After the whistle sounded, Schladig, who had been sleeping in his clothes all this time, had already arrived at the front line. This young military noble did not say much. He took a deep breath, grabbed a soldier's bow, pulled out a pointed arrow from the quiver, and knocked it on the bow. He lowered his shoulders, straightened his left arm, and half-turned his elbow. He placed his weight on his left leg and stretched out his upper body. Using a slightly awkward posture, he pulled the bowstring all the way to his ear. In order to pull the 140-pound bow, Schladig's arms, back and abdomen were all exerting force. His back muscles were bulging, his abdomen was tight, and the blood vessels in his arms were bulging. His left hand that held the bow was already pale red. Since young, Schladig did not have the night blindness that many people in this era suffered from. With the help of the hastily lit torch, he saw the group of bodyguards chasing after the small team of engineers. The bow was bent like a full moon, and the arrow was like a shooting star. Accompanied by the sound of the bowstring vibrating, the arrow, which was specially designed to pierce through armor, swung left and right and shot towards the closest bodyguard. In order to not make too much noise, these bodyguards who followed Number 34 in the night attack did not wear any armor. The armor-piercing arrow was not obstructed at all. After piercing through one person's chest, it even pierced through another person's abdomen. And this was the reason why these bodyguards broke down in an instant. They ran for their lives in the direction of the mansion, hating their parents for not giving them a few more legs. On the other hand, because Schladig's commander had killed the enemy before the battle, the rest of his men were also motivated. The soldiers with flintlock guns also rushed over, aimed at the fleeing bodyguards and pulled the trigger. Bang bang bang! The lead bullets flew over a distance of 50 to 60 yards. Although the accuracy was greatly reduced, there were still a lot of people shooting. The bodyguards were hit by bullets one by one. As they ran, one of them would fall to the ground and never get up again. And this scene just so happened to fall into the eyes of the many defenders who had climbed up the walls of the mansion because they heard the gunshots. The morale of the troops is working. Schladig suddenly woke up. As a military aristocrat, even if he was not a famous general, he had been influenced by what he saw and heard since he was young. This gave him a much more sensitive battlefield intuition than the average person. After realizing that the enemy's morale was low, and looking at the trench that was less than 20 yards away from the wall, Schladig immediately called for his messengers. Have 5 assault teams enter the trench. Tonight, all of you will climb up with me. Chapter 11:35. The siege lasted from midnight to dawn. The morale of the city guards under Schladig's command was indeed high. Although they did not have much experience in siege warfare, they still managed to break through a section of the high wall of the Messias family's mansion and broke into the mansion. However, except for Schladig, the commander of the Wolf Knights and a few others, what happened next surprised most of the others. What's going on? There's a wall in the mansion? The county governor's house is built like a nested fortress. Layer after layer. Layer after layer. How do we fight? Unlike the disheartened soldiers, Schladig and the commander of the Wolf Knights were more familiar with the mansion, so they were not surprised by the wall that suddenly appeared in front of them. The Messias family's mansion had a construction warehouse. There were large materials, such as wood, stones, tenons and nails, which were usually prepared to repair the wall and other buildings. When something happened, as long as the door of the construction warehouse was opened, the materials could be moved out. Wooden stakes were set up, rattan baskets were strung together, and then the rattan baskets were filled with mud. After that, the wall would be completed with lime and mortar. This kind of work did not require much skill. To put it bluntly, even a dog could do it if given a meat bone. However, Schladiger did not feel annoyed or any other negative emotions. Instead, he felt a little gratified. After a night of desperate attacks, the lives and effort paid off. The largest water reservoir in the mansion, which was the large pond used as a fish pond near the wall, was indeed too tense. Hence, number 34 and number 27 had no choice but to abandon it. Now, except for a few small patio reservoirs that could collect rainwater and snow water, there was no water reservoir in the mansion. The location of the underground water channel that led to the well in the mansion had been found by Schladig's spellcasters. They had either sealed it or diverted it. There were nearly 300 mouths in the mansion. Drinking water was a big problem every day. It could be said that the siege battle was basically over. Pass down my order. Rest for today. Go to a few butcher shops in the city and buy everything. I want to treat the soldiers to meat. Schladiger gave the messenger a pouch full of silver coins, and ordered his troops to be entertained. Soon, the dispiritedness of the city guards from seeing another city wall was swept away. Hearing that there was meat to eat, the soldiers couldn't help but shout in excitement, waking up the whole Wallensburg. The siege last night had caused most of the surrounding residents to be unable to sleep peacefully. Now, they all had dark circles under their eyes. Hearing the ghostly howls of the city garrison guards, many people hiding in their houses spat out their saliva and cursed them incessantly. However, they didn't know that this level of disaster of war was actually a blessing compared to what they would experience later. Even though no banners were raised, everyone familiar with the military structure of Southern Tapt knew that King Vixeth would definitely be part of the crusade against the invaders since Alavra's legion had been mobilized. In the temporary command room of this army, which was also the mansion of a country squire, a serious and peaceful conversation was taking place between two old men around a bonfire, waiting for the meat soup to be cooked. On one side was Vixeth, and on the other side was another old man. Esther Vixeth called out the old man's name. The name meant eagle in the Tapt language, and the old man sitting opposite him did indeed have an eye-catching hooked nose. Not only that, but his eyes were also as bright and spirited as an eagle's. Why don't you agree with my plan? I just don't understand. Esther lifted his hood, revealing a bald head covered in metal patches. Under the hood, his body was basically made of mechanical structures. We've sacrificed so much. Isn't this the day we've been waiting for? We'll teach those soft maple and Yomians a lesson, and let the merchant behind them know of our strength. And then? My dear brother, Vixeth interrupted Esther's words. The old man opposite him was not only the commander of the Alavra Legion, but he was also Vixeth's younger brother. Although you and I know very well that there is an 80% chance that the scale of perpetual order will not dispatch its own army, even so, what can we do? Esther stared at his brother. We are not afraid of their agent. Your Majesty, my brother, from the moment I decided to replace you as the first soldier of the Alavra Legion 40 years ago, I had already made up my mind to sacrifice everything. We want to win the right to survive in this plane for our country, for our family, and for our future generations. We no longer need to rely on others. Now, the Megalosaurus army will not come to the battlefield. As long as we can eliminate all the enemies in this proxy war, then Tapt Island will. This island is still in this plane, King Vixeth interrupted again. You've been to the Ramsey Plain, learned their knowledge, and even used a fake identity to obtain the honorary title of Herad. In terms of knowledge, I'm not as good as you. But we went to King's Landing together those years. I was a low-level employee of the Scale of Perpetual Order for 10 years. I know that merchant better than you do. Esther did not refute Vixitha's words. This was not only because Vixith was his brother and his king, but also because what Vixith said was true. Moreover, when they were living in King's Landing City more than 50 years ago, it was precisely because of Vixitha's income from working at the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce that Esther was able to successfully graduate from that university and obtain the honor of Herad. The goal of the Scale of Perpetual Order has never been to create wealth, or rather, it has never been just to create wealth. It is more concerned about its power to distribute wealth. As I told you before, any power is like a poisoned wine, and those who drink this wine usually become numb, lose their initiative, and gradually turn from a giant into dust. However, the Scale of Perpetual Order has such a problem, and a country that exists in a small place like Tapt will also have similar contradictions. In the past few decades, under your and my management, the country has indeed made great strides forward. And it seems that this speed of progress has no intention of stopping. However, if we can conclude that there will be a day when the Scale of Perpetual Order will be stronger than it is, then it is a little too optimistic and naive. After all, the Chamber of Commerce may become decadent, but its power, or the strongest power it has, comes from the Megalosaurus. As a scholar of Herad, you must know how young the Megalosaurus is. If we want to challenge the authority of the Scale of Perpetual Order, we will definitely anger the Megalosaurus. We can't make a losing deal. Moreover, only the stupidest of fellows will treat war as a goal. Rational people know that war is only a means to achieve a certain goal. Esther continued to digest Vixitha's words. As usual, he respected his elder brother, but at the same time, he was very willing to listen and evaluate the meaning of his words. After a while, Commander Oliveira finally understood something. Only then did he look at his elder brother through the flames that rose from the crackling firewood. You mean, he fights his and I fight mine? This time, it was King Vixitha's turn to think. However, his ability to think was not inferior to his younger brother's. Soon, a smile appeared on his face. The king of the country laughed, as if he had returned to the time when he was 18 or 19 years old, when he successfully sneaked out of the house with his younger brother and successfully arrived at King's Landing City. It was also like more than 30 years ago, about 10 years after the establishment of the Oliveira Legion. At that time, he had also turned the territory controlled by his family into a country that covered the entire southern region of Tap. Together with the other large and small families in the north, he ruled under the Shane River. Now, he was laughing because he had finally convinced Esther that the opportunity to unify Tapt had arrived. Chapter 1136. The southern wall of Valensburg was also known as the Wall of Heavy Gates. Its history was almost as long as the city itself, and it had always been an unchanging legend on Tapt Island. Merchants, petitioners, envoys from the southern court, or armies with the ambition of conquering and plundering would first see the huge land wall that the first ruler of Valenberg, the cunning fox lord, began to build when he was in his prime. It stretched across the gently undulating land, from one horizon to the other, with endless ramparts and towers. Under the sunlight, the surface of the limestone wall turned a brilliant snow-white. The joints of the red bricks formed continuous horizontal lines, and there were also arrow holes with domes on the wall. Some of the towers were square, some hexagonal, some octagonal, and occasionally round. They clustered around each other and were very close to each other. A famous traveler once described it in his published travel journal. A 7-year-old boy could throw an apple from one tower to another. The wall was divided into several levels, all the way up to the top of the inner wall, where the Lord's flag proudly fluttered in the wind. there was a heavily guarded, gloomy gate at intervals on the wall. In peacetime, people and animals entered and left through these gates. At the southern end of the wall, a gate decorated with gold plates and marble and bronze statues shone in the sunlight. This was the Arc de Triomphe. It was a huge and magnificent arch, with majestic towers made of polished marble on both sides. During the heyday of the cunning fox lord, the city did not belong to the kingdom, but was his private territory. Every time there was a war, the victorious lord and his vassals would pass through the Arc de Triomphe with the symbols of victory, the conquered nobles in chains, the land deed that had been reclaimed, the naked slaves, the carriages piled with spoils, and the mighty army. The change of ownership of the city was entirely due to an accident. The year the cunning fox lord passed away, there was an earthquake in the area around Valensburg, and large sections of the city walls collapsed due to the severe earthquake. Macius, who had just taken over the position of lord, immediately mobilized everyone in the city to deal with this crisis. At that time, apart from King Vixeth, who had been eyeing the area that was half free from the rule of the country, a large area in the north of Tapped Island was in famine. Therefore, not only were there many small groups of bandits, but there were also some scattered so-called duchies and earls, who were very interested in crossing the Seine River and robbing the rich Valensburg. They had long been sharpening their blades, waiting to run over and ruthlessly slaughter them. Although Macius had given the order to mobilize, firstly, he had just taken over the power of the cunning fox liege, and his foundation was not stable yet. Secondly, he really did not have much money left in his treasury, and he did not have the material foundation to revitalize Valensburg. Helpless, Macius, who was only in his early 20s at the time, could only voluntarily give up his independence in exchange for the help of the lord of the country, Vixeth. The latter would spend money, and the city's Druid faction would contribute. In the end, nearly 20,000 citizens were mobilized, and in a short 2 months, the city walls were completely rebuilt. Not only did they restore the original design of the cunning fox liege, but they also added an outer wall with a series of towers, a protective parapet, and a brick moat, forming an extremely complicated and daunting obstacle. At this time, the entire defense system of Valensburg included 60 towers, divided into 5 defense zones, more than 100 feet deep, and more than 60 feet tall from the bottom of the moat to the top of the towers. This city was the embodiment of all the wisdom of city defense before the era of gunpowder weapons. The core of the defense system was still the inner wall. The inner wall was made of concrete, and then the inner and outer sides were covered with large pieces of limestone from the nearby quarries. Bricks were inserted to make the entire structure more stable. The battle platform at the top of the wall was protected by the battlements, and there were stairs from below to the platform at the top. In terms of design, the towers were not connected to the wall, which ensured that the towers and the wall could be stabilized without breaking. The towers were 60 feet tall and had several rooms. The roof was flat and could be used to throw stones, ballistae, and other machinery. The sentries at the top of the towers constantly scanned the horizon, and at night, they would shout to the sentries on the other towers along the wall to prevent them from falling asleep. The inner wall was 40 feet tall, and the outer wall was slightly lower, less than 30 feet, so the towers on the outer wall were lower than those on the inner wall. Between the inner and outer walls was a 30 feet wide platform made of rammed earth. The soldiers defending the outer wall were gathered there, ready to engage the enemy at any time. The outer wall was about 60 feet away from the moat, and any invaders who crossed the moat would be slaughtered a second time in this space. However, the impeccable defense system of this kind had to be built on the assumption that the attacking side lacked large-scale artillery deployment. When building Valensburg for Mercius, King Vixius had also been careful not to reveal the secrets of the new era's war to him. Of course, with the intensity of the war in Tapped Island, Valensburg could be considered a majestic city. When the combined army of the Soft Maple and Yomians took over Valensburg, Naumann immediately sought out Elder André, who had surrendered. He hoped that he could get him to release some of the restrictions set up by the druids of the city, so that the city walls could automatically extend with horse-faced walls, artillery platforms, star fortresses, and other defensive facilities. However, Andre's reply was very firm. Absolutely not. All of the restrictions in the city have been locked down. This way, the subordinates of King Vixius can't use specific runes to attack us from the inside. Once some of the restrictions are broken, who knows when those loopholes will be taken over by the druids in the upcoming siege battle, and they will regain control of the city. It was precisely because of this that Naaman had no choice but to convince Grisus first. He then convinced all the commanders of the combined army to hand over the gold and silver they had plundered from the various guilds' headquarters and used it to recruit civilians to block the city gates, dig deeper trenches, and build triangular fortresses. In order to increase the defensive capabilities of the city, they even put in a lot of effort in setting up the cannons. There was no lack of roasted gunpowder in the military warehouse of Valensburg, but the cannons that Magistrate Mercius had were basically stone cannons that fired granite bullets. There were only a few barrel cannons that could fire iron bullet. As for the advanced howitzers that could only be bought from the scale of perpetual order, they didn't even have a single one. In order to make use of the original stone cannons, the combined army also requisitioned all the blacksmiths in the city to start crafting cannons while they were building new defensive structures. First, the blacksmiths used clay mixed with finely chopped linen and hemp to create a cannon barrel mold about 10 feet long. The mold was split into two parts. The front part used to hold the stone cannons had a diameter of 30 inches, while the rear part used to hold the gunpowder was smaller. Then, they had to dig a large hole and place the finished clay mold into the hole with the muzzle facing down. Then, they covered the mold with a layer of clay and fixed it in place like a sword sheath. There was a gap between the two layers of clay for the molten metal to be inserted. Finally, the entire structure had to be tightly packed with iron, wood, mud, and stone. They had to be pressed from the outside to support the huge weight of the bronze. A layer of damp sand would be sprinkled on top of the mold to cover the entire structure, leaving only a bowl-sized hole for the molten metal to be inserted. In addition to the need to fire the mold, they also had to prepare a kind of clay for the outer wall and use large stones to fix the furnace. They had to be able to withstand the high temperature of the molten copper, and they had to bury the furnace with a small mountain of charcoal so deep that only the mouth of the furnace was exposed. When the most experienced blacksmiths judged that the temperature in the furnace had reached the correct value, the workers began to put copper pieces into the crucible. Fortunately, the Naaman Gate had assigned some spellcasters to help, otherwise the work would have been incredibly dangerous. The workers had to put the copper pieces into the bubbling cauldron one by one and use metal ladles to scoop up the floating residue. The tin alloy emitted a poisonous gas. If the metal pieces were wet, the water it carried would turn into steam and cause the furnace to burst, killing everyone standing nearby. When the liquid metal began to flow out, it was bright enough to illuminate the faces of people 100 steps away. The molten metal flowed slowly along the clay pipe like magma and slowly entered the hole of the cannon mold. At this time, the sweaty workers poked the sticky metal with very long wooden sticks to burst the bubbles, which could cause the metal to burst during firing. The bronze flowed from the pipe into the mold until it was full and a little overflowed. Thus the cannon was cast. The damp sand around the mold slowed down the cooling process and prevented the bronze from breaking during the process. When the metal had cooled, the workers used animal-powered lifting equipment to dig out the larvae wrapped in cocoons and drag them to the surface to cool, polish, and examine them. At the beginning of the work, the craftsmen had cast a batch of barrel cannons without knowing what was going on. However, they were quickly stopped by the Naaman Gate and turned to the construction of shorter and simpler mortar cannons. It was not easy to place barrel cannons on the city walls. When they were fired, they could cause more damage to the walls than the enemy cannonballs. Therefore, most of the barrel cannons could only be placed on specially built firing platforms and on the newly built triangular bastions outside the city walls. On the other hand, the curved projectile cannons could be placed on the city walls more often. These cannons did not have a large charge capacity, and the recoil force was more perpendicular to the ground. After more than 10 days of hard work, the people of Valensburg had begun to forget that the city had changed hands and had gotten used to the new life of work, and get paid. Suddenly, a smoky skateboat came from the south of the city and broke the pattern. When the alarm sounded, all the workers were sent away from the city gates, warehouses, and other important places. Except for some young men who were recruited to guard the city, all the people of Valensburg were ordered to stay in their homes and not come out. Anyone who goes out on the streets without permission will be killed. The Namen Gate issued a martial law order without mercy. Chapter 1137. When they advance, their spears are like a forest. When they stop, their tents cover the land. Naaman could not help but sigh as he watched from the top of the city wall. Thanks to the mobility of the skimmers, the Joint Army had already known of the army's exact existence when it appeared more than 100 miles south of Wallingsburg. After that, the Joint Army still relied on the scouting method of the skimmers to figure out the composition of the Army's departments and the general strength of each department. The result was surprising. The total number of this army of more than 20,000 was calculated by the Combat Investigation Department of the Joint Legion by counting the cooking stoves in the abandoned camp and inquiring about the amount of food and salt purchased from the villages and towns along the way. Other than the civilian workers who were responsible for assisting the engineering troops, there were at least 17,000 soldiers left. All of them were professional soldiers. Many of the commanders of the Allied army could not understand how the fake King Vixith had managed to raise so many soldiers who had been released from their jobs on this tiny piece of land in the south of Tapt Island. Did those soldiers not need to eat every day? How did they deal with the damage to their ordnance caused by their daily training? They could not be blamed for having such questions. The expeditionary army formed by the Yomians and the soft maple people numbered in the tens of thousands. But in reality, most of them were ordinary civilians who had been recruited from the Ramsey continent. Before coming to Tapt Island, they had not been baptized by blood and fire. It was very likely that the cruelest battle they had ever experienced in their lives was actually a wild beast hunt or a tavern brawl. On paper, we outnumber them by 2.5 times, but in reality, they have more soldiers than we do. In the Joint Army's battle conference, the undisputed leader of the soft maple people, Grisus, said bluntly, "Otherwise we wouldn't have had to send out a few elite 1,000-man squads to lead the charge. The rest of the squads could only follow slowly behind and act as auxiliary troops. Those who could participate in this battle conference were all wise people among the soft maple people and Yomians. They all knew the capabilities of their troop. Apart from a small number of professional soldiers who were released from work or semi-released from work, the rest were basically auxiliary and military personnel. Supply teams, carpenters, cannon smiths, blacksmiths, ordnance smiths, tailors, pastry chefs, craftsmen, peddlers, and others who followed the army for profit or loot. Thus, at this moment, they were all muttering in their hearts. To be honest, even if they defended the city, this battle would not be easy to fight. As if sensing the doubts of the crowd, Naaman, who had already discussed with Grisus how to deal with the situation, spoke. One of them reported the worries, while the other reported the good news. "You don't have to worry too much." The legendary pirate King Joms looked at the crowd with a smile. "Do you really think that the false King Vixith gathered this army just to fight us in Wallingsburg?" Seeing the confused looks on everyone's faces, Naaman continued to explain. "Lord Grisus also said that compared to us, the enemy's army actually has a numerical advantage. Moreover, this didn't even take into account the other party's military equipment. If the false king really only wants to drive us out of Tapt Island, He doesn't need to wait for us to enter Wallingsburg. He can just force us to fight in the wild. The reason why he let us enter this city, and gave us more than 10 days to set up defenses, is purely because he needs us to stay here. Otherwise, what excuse does he have to mobilize his army? What excuse does he have to use this army to flatten the entire tapped island? Like a sudden clap of thunder, Na Men's words exploded in everyone's hearts. These lords and commanders were stunned at first, but after thinking carefully for a moment, they suddenly understood. So that's it. No wonder. So, this is also an opportunity for us. How do we fight? How long do we fight? How do we amass wealth? In fact, in this siege, both of us can get the answer, Na Men said with a smile. The false King Vixeth has invited us to the negotiation table. Outside Wallingsburg, cannons were mounted on disc-wheeled carts that slowly advanced on the hastily built Gigi road in the autumn rain. It took a long time for them to reach the front line. The noises of their progress could be heard from far away. The bulls pulling the carts struggled and roared loudly. The people driving the carts shouted. The creaking axles produced a continuous, monotonous music, like the strange sound waves emitted by the stars. When the cannons reached the front line, the attacking army spent a long time using heavy machinery to unload each cannon from the carts, deploy them in place, and adjust the angle of fire. In the afternoon, only a few light cannons were ready. They launched the first round of bombardment on Wallingsburg, but it was obviously ineffective. Most of the cannonballs aimed at the towers of the city walls from a kilometer or two away did not hit their target. Only a few cannonballs landed on the temporary anti-artillery installations on the city walls. Layers of sheepskin and wool blankets that were soaked in water were tied to the wooden frames that protruded out of the walls. These were all from the warehouse of the city's leather and textile guild. When the cannonballs hit them, they made a pop sound like a mallet hitting leather. But because the force was neutralized, they did not cause any damage. When the defending soldiers saw this, they all cheered and sighed in disdain. Even the young men who were temporarily recruited to defend Wallingsburg were no exception. These people did not seem to realize that the attacking army outside the city was actually sent by their king in name. In war, soldiers can only know what is happening within 3 to 4 yards of them. Sergeants know more about what is happening within 50 to 60 yards of them. Only a true commander can see the whole picture. The prerequisite is that he is a qualified military commander. Namen and Grisus led the guards to the top of the city wall to inspect the defense of the army. At the same time, they urged the junior sergeants to look for deserters who were not afraid to fight. This is not right. Grisus, who was walking side by side with Namen, did not hear Namen's words. Instead, he frowned and looked at the army from the false King Vixeth in the distance. According to the skimmers, especially the last skimmer that escaped and returned to the camp, the enemy has more advanced cannons, steam tanks, rotary wing helicopters, and other advanced ordnance. Why did they look like they were fooling around when the first batch of soldiers attacked the city? These cannons are similar to the ones we made in a hurry. Vixeth can't expect to scare us with these cannons, right? If that's the case, won't the Triangle Fortress and other arrangements be flirting with a blind man? Fooling around? Namen chuckled and continued the conversation. It really is fooling around. The essence of war. Oh no, it should be said that the essence of war is actually a ritual since ancient times. From the ancient warrior duels between the small tribes to the gunfire and cannons of the present, wars are calculated using these things. As for the number of casualties, it's actually just a measurement tool needed for calculation. Wait and see, that false King Vixeth must have some new tricks up his sleeve. Ha! As a contract demon, Namen's most proud talent was his glib tongue. Persuasion was the foundation of his survival. Through a well-founded analysis, he was able to easily suppress Grisus's worries and divert the soft maple leader's attention from the war. As for why he did this, the answer was for the benefit of the scale of perpetual order. In the face of the Chamber of Commerce and the great Megalosaurus Key's interests, the soft maple and Yomians were just tools. As tools, it was not a problem for them to have the ability to think. However, Naman felt that tools were not qualified to understand something as precious as reality. You fight yours and I'll fight mine. If you want to play a game of swapping, then I'll play with you, Naman thought to himself as he walked down the city wall with Grisus. Of course, he still had a smile on his face, as if he was very satisfied with the arrangement of the city guards. Apart from the cannons, not long after the battle began, a group of enthusiastic irregular troops from southern Tapt launched a messy attack on the water gate at the side of the city. Only this city gate had a canal passing through it, so it was impossible to build a triangular fortress to block the enemy's attack. The reason why it could be determined that the attackers were irregular troops was because they did not have uniforms. The military commander only led a team of supervisors behind them and urged them to charge towards the city gate. It seemed that he had no intention of leading an attack. The equipment of the irregular troops was naturally not as good as that of the regular army. Most of them were only equipped with some old long-range weapons, such as muskets and forks. The weapons they used for close combat were simply wooden mallets that were about 4 feet long, slightly thinner at the near end, and with a few long nails at the far end. These were the so-called bayonets. Moreover, without the intervention of the supervisors, these irregular troops liked to group up when charging. Therefore, to save on gunpowder, the defenders did not use the mortar cannons on the city wall. They only used muskets, bows, and crossbows to launch a wave of long-range attacks at the group of people. What was slightly unexpected was that although the training and equipment of these irregular troops were ridiculously poor, it was not wrong to say that they were enthusiastic. After launching their charge, not a single one of them left the battlefield alive. All of them ran towards the city wall like a swarm of bees. After running out of ammunition for their muskets and forks, some of them even threw their bayonets like javelins at the city wall in a fit of passion. The charge of about 160 people, which was about 200 people, caused more casualties than the cannons that bombarded the tower. After eliminating all of them, the military commander on the city wall counted the casualties and found that there were more than 10 people on his side who had suffered light injuries, and 3 who were seriously injured. The most unlucky young man who died was knocked unconscious by a bayonet, not smashed to death, and fell to his death from the city wall. Chapter 1138. How were they supposed to fight a siege? The answer was surprise attacks, artillery bombardments, and blockades. However, if one were to expand the question to include all wars, this answer would probably still be a good one. At most, one could add a few modifiers. Tolerance for bloodshed, contempt for human life, adaptation to a cruel environment, and so on. Of course, these were all things that both sides had to go through. It was very, very difficult to take a city without shedding blood. Taking Valensburg without shedding a drop of blood like what Narman had done previously was definitely a rare occurrence in a siege. Moreover, Narman had the support of the Merchant Guild behind him. Many spies who had been hiding there all year round had done a lot of basic work for him. This kind of success was almost impossible to replicate. Under the cover of the night, a few wooden lifts were lowered from the top of the walls. A few strong figures quickly ran out of the city from the lift. Leading the group was the soft maple Ulfric. The berserker had already recovered from his injuries. However, since his unit had disappeared, he could only lead a few veterans who had also been disbanded after the siege began to supervise the young men who were temporarily recruited. During the day, a group of Tapt's men launched a brainless attack on the walls near the water gate of Valensburg. Although all of them ended up dead, they still caused some trouble for the defenders on the walls. After nightfall, Ulfric didn't trust the young men of Valensburg to work on the walls, so he had to personally take care of the corpses piled up outside the city. Even though it was already autumn, if more than 160 corpses were left to lie on the walls, the defenders on the walls would probably be tortured like a biochemical attack in a few days. Not to mention, the corpses could contaminate the canal that flowed through the water gate. If the siege really reached its most difficult point, the water flowing through the canal might be a life-saving reservoir. There were only two things Ulfric had to do. First, gather up as many of the corpses as possible, drench them with kerosene, find some dry wood, the men's maces could also be used as firewood, and burn them all. Second, find 1 or 2 whole corpses and bury them. During the day, the irregular army had displayed a fighting spirit unbefitting of their status, and Ulfric needed to find out why. Most of the people who left the city with Ulfric were veterans of the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army. There were also some basic officers among them. Most of them were injured before and handed over their commanding rights while recuperating. With the establishment of the Joint Army, new commanders had been appointed to their original units. Therefore, they could only take over the job of managing the youths in Wallensburg. It was precisely because of this that these people's combat skills were incomparable to those youths who had never been on the battlefield. In this night mission, these people all consciously held their breaths and kept their mouths shut. They didn't have to be like the trembling citizens who had to be tied with wooden sticks in their mouths to prevent them from making noise. There were only 10 people in this squad who were temporarily recruited from the city. Considering that these people hadn't seen much blood before, Ulfric assigned them the task of collecting the enemy's weapons, collecting the wooden maces to use as firewood, and collecting the guns that didn't seem to be damaged at all. They didn't have to collect the guns. Although they were already obsolete, they weren't that outdated. After transporting them to the city walls and confirming that they could still be used, these youths could use them. As for the work of moving and gathering the corpses, it could only be done by the 20 veterans led by Ulfric. Most of the citizens who were temporarily recruited didn't have the guts to touch the bloody corpses at close range. Of course, this dirty and tiring work wasn't just a burden to the veterans. Ulfric had already explained to them, "You can keep the things you loot." Receiving permission meant that the Soft Maple and Yamshans could freely plunder wealth from the corpses. They didn't have to worry about being harassed by the supervisors or disciplinary officers. However, after working in full swing for a while, these people's movements gradually slowed down. The reason was simple. They didn't find any wealth on the corpses of the people who charged to the gates of Warlensburg. These people definitely aren't regular soldiers, but an army made up of motley crew. Shouldn't they try their best to keep everything valuable on themselves? Unless, as he worked and gathered the corpses together, Ulfric pondered. The Soft Maple berserker was still quite smart when he wasn't in a frenzied state. He quickly realized something. These people don't have any wealth of their own. Tapt Island doesn't keep slaves, so they're most likely prisoners. Ulfric deduced the true identity of this wave of attackers. His guess was actually correct. These people were indeed a group of felons that King Vixith had temporarily transferred from prisons all over the country. That was why Vixith had only equipped them with crude weapons and clothes that were slightly better than prison uniforms. He didn't equip them with more expensive armor like regular soldiers. In other words, Vixith had sent them to the edge of the city to receive their death sentence. He had no intention of letting them return to camp at all. While it sounded a little cold-blooded, Vixith's actions weren't considered cruel. After all, if all the felons were killed, there would most likely be some wrongful convictions. However, if they were lined up and killed one by one, there would definitely be some that would slip through the net. After the entire southern nation of Tapt was mobilized, the felons might be able to show their worth through free labor. However, there was no reason to let the felons stay in prison after the autumn harvest to waste food. Ulfric just didn't understand. If these people were felons, where did their unflinching determination come from when they charged towards the city walls in the afternoon? Did the false King Vixith use his speech to boost their morale, Or did he use empty promises to trick these brainless fellows into willingly putting their lives on the line? Based on what the soft maple berserkers felt, while the prisoners' equipment was terrible and they had almost no training, their morale wasn't low at all. Among the young men who were conscripted from Valensburg to defend the city, there were quite a few whose fighting spirit couldn't compare to theirs. How strange, but it's a good thing there's someone else to think about this problem, Ulfric thought to himself. He then picked 2 whole corpses and had 2 veterans drag them back to the wooden lifts beside the city walls. There were already alchemists, herbalists, military mages, and a few doctors waiting on the walls. They would secretly dissect the 2 corpses in the tower to find out why these people were so brave and fearless. But at that moment, Ulfric suddenly heard a cry of surprise. It wasn't from his side. The rookies had sticks tied to their mouths, and the veterans were either soft maple or yomusi. They didn't know how to shout in Tap's dialect. He couldn't help but squint his eyes. With the help of the hazy moonlight, he could see clearly what was going on at the place where the cry of surprise came from. As it turned out, apart from the defenders who sent people to clean up the corpses, the attackers also sent some people. These people all carried baskets half the height of a person. Within the baskets were some muskets, spears, and other weapons they picked up from the corpses. "Don't let those people leave." Ulfric's expression was fierce. He drew the long sword at his waist with a whoosh. Because he had to leave the city to do manual labor, he didn't bring the battle-axe he was best at. However, the berserker didn't back down just because his weapon wasn't handy. The moment he saw the enemy, he was the first to charge out. He held a long sword in one hand and a revolver in the other. It was a symbol of his status, and it was also convenient for him to execute any young men who didn't dare to move forward when he was supervising the battle. In the blink of an eye, he caught up to a fleeing tapped soldier. He swung his long sword at the enemy. The edge of the blade struck the basket. Although it didn't cause any significant damage, it made the soldier lose his balance and fall to the ground. Before the man could get up, Ulfric aimed the revolver at his head. After a loud bang, the man couldn't move anymore. When the gunshot rang out, the defenders on the walls immediately reacted. A large tourmaline searchlight was lit up. The bright light was reflected by the mirror and shone on the battlefield. Because they were worried about accidentally injuring their allies, the defenders didn't shoot with their spears or crossbows. However, the illumination provided was enough to help Ulfric and the others. Under the illumination of the electric searchlight, Tap's corpse collection team could be seen at a glance. Some people always had a misconception that cold weapons are heavier than hot weapons. But in fact, if one didn't consider the weight of armor and some special cold weapons, most cold weapons were lighter than hot weapons. Even a so-called two-handed heavy sword weighed 2 to 3 kilograms at most. A spear or a musket could easily weigh close to 5 kilograms. There were less than 20 Taps who came to collect weapons with their basket. Their baskets were all filled to the brim. They couldn't run even if they wanted to. On the other hand, apart from Ulfric himself, the other veterans who followed him out didn't carry any weapons at all. After hearing the order, they basically picked up a spike from the ground and rushed forward to kill. As for the dozen or so young men who were recruited, Ulfric and the other veterans didn't take them seriously at all. They didn't need their help. The number of veterans was about the same as Tap's corpse collection team. In a one-on-one fight, the well-trained veterans would undoubtedly have an advantage. Using his revolver, Ulfric took down 3 of them with 6 bullets and killed 2 more with his saber. As for the rest of the Taps, apart from a few who were smarter and dropped their baskets midway and ran back to the camp, the rest were all caught up by the soft maple and Yamian veterans. They either died from the spikes of their spikes or had their heads smashed by their clubs. Pour oil on them and light them up. We're retreating. After piling up the corpses, Ulfric immediately gave the order to retreat. The charge just now had taken some time, and the searchlights on the walls hadn't been extinguished yet. With his excellent eyesight, He could already see from afar that a group of neatly armored soldiers had walked out of the tapped camp. They were all riding horses and carrying flintlock muskets. He didn't want to encounter the enemy's flintlock cavalry outside the walls. Chapter 1139. The woman writhed in Arthas's arms, his sharp teeth sinking deep into her neck, thirsting for the red river of life in her body. Before her life force was completely exhausted, he could not stop in time as expected. Demons were not good at self-discipline. So, he threw the woman to the ground contemptuously, stood up, stepped over her body, and walked to another captive. At the same time, he stuck out his tongue and licked the remaining blood at the corner of his mouth. The remaining 5 people were tied together by vines as rope. The vines were stained with blood, and all of them fell limp on the cave floor. In the past few hours, he had enjoyed the blood of each of them one by one, and before the last ritual, he would drink it again. He would squeeze every drop of blood from their bodies and use this power to break free from this ridiculous and pathetic body. He smiled, and in the dim light, his smile was as sharp as a razor. Arthas reached out to hold the wall of the cave, the hard stone creaking under the weight of his knuckles. This was just the beginning. Now his memory was not so chaotic. He had drunk enough blood. Although he was still weak, he was much stronger than when he first started. It was enough to support him for the next step, whatever it was. He lowered his head and looked at the humans in the cave who had died in vain. He raised his hands, and the rotten wind of death gathered around him. A cold spell came out of his mouth. Slowly, the dead began to tremble. They struggled, twisted, and finally sat up. Some of them were still holding weapons that were no longer useful to them. Arthas closed his eyes. In his mind, he could hear the terrified moans of the owners of these bodies when they realized their situation. It was as beautiful as music. He smiled, reveling in the fear of the victims and a few scattered bystanders. Manipulating death was a wonderful thing. Taking these souls away from their original owners brought a primitive pleasure. The only thing that could compare to it was killing them. "This is just the beginning," Arthas hissed. For a half-demon like him, conquest was second nature. They were created to kill, conquer, and rule. This nature was even stronger than the desire to destroy that they inherited from demons. The monarch of darkness, his father, had taught him this. It was one of the few useful things his creator had taught him. Only the strongest can conquer it, and only the most cunning and shrewd can rule it. Recalling what Graz ZT had told him about the secrets of the multiverse, Arthas was convinced. However, his current strength was still far from reaching the level of the Overlord of Darkness. What was even worse was that, for some unknown reason, Keys had erased part of his memory. He was trapped in this material plane, trapped in this body built by the demonized deer, and the gap between him and the strongest had increased immeasurably. Therefore, through the most primitive demonic means, that is, by sucking the blood of intelligent creatures, twisting their souls, and luring them into depravity, Arthas finally received a little bit of grace from the great chaotic evil will of the abyss, allowing his mind to regain some clarity. He did not continue to linger around Wallingsburg, nor did he dare to advance recklessly into the heart of Taft's southern kingdom. Instead, he took advantage of the tense situation before the war and hurriedly made his way to this lawless land located at the center of Tapt Island, which was located outside the law. Arthas went into hiding and began his business in the mode of a corrupted being that best suited the current conditions. First, he took out all the branches of the abyss species, sod dryads, that he had stored in his subspace equipment and found a forest to cultivate them, providing him with the necessary protection. Then, he plundered some slave hunters who sold their loot in the lawless land, snatching a batch of slaves from them for consumption and entertainment. Finally, he used a lump of dental grime that Graz ZT had given him that originally belonged to the Abyss Ghoul King, Dorison, to creatively cultivate mutated Abyss Ghouls with strong pollution. Arthas did not create these ghouls to use them to protect his lair. In fact, these mutated ghouls were far less powerful than the abyss species, sod dryads, that he had cultivated. The greatest use of these monsters was to provide Arthas with a rare magic material. The son of the demon lord would pluck out the mutated canine teeth that grew out of them every day. Through a series of complicated abyss alchemy, Arthas could make the mutated canine teeth into a kind of tooth powder. And this tooth powder was an important raw material for a weak berserker potion. Being in the lawless land did not mean that Arthas did not need to communicate with the outside world. On the contrary, in order to realize one of his plans, he had to obtain a lot of supplies and other magic materials from the outside world. Therefore, he created this tooth powder and used it to trade with the merchants who came to the lawless land to trade in the black market in exchange for some of the things he needed: an activating growth agent, a body-refining formula, fresh blood of a megalosaurus bloodline creature, a powerful painkiller made with high-purity moon candy, and spores of a hemostatic fungus. I must break the current shackles. This simple shell can't trap me. Every time he thought of this, Arthas's heart would burn with passion. Every day, when he checked the items he had obtained from the trade, he would involuntarily use his nails to cut a wound on the demonic deer, and then use the scar formed after the wound healed to remind himself of how many days he had been preparing. And today, after waiting for so long, he had finally waited for the final moment of the trade. A magic brazier used for trading suddenly burst into flames. Arthas waved his hand and stabilized the flames into the shape of a porch. The black market merchant who traded with him did not show his face. He just stretched out a hand wearing an iron glove and holding a linen bag from the flaming porch. Seeing this, Arthas immediately picked up a linen bag that was much larger than the other parties and handed over a bag full of abyss ghoul tooth powder from the flaming porch. Then, both parties began to verify the goods. Finally, when the flaming porch disappeared, Arthas only had the linen bag left in his hand. Galander sniffed the air. "Rotten meat," he said in a low voice. "And it's been rotten for a long time." Harriman leaned forward and gripped his longsword tightly. Keyes, who was disguised as the young gunslinger Hugh Hood, and the dwarf Galander protected his flanks from the left and right. Harriman's old servant, Weather, pulled out 2 long daggers and walked at the back of the group, looking after their backs. Using the method Keyes came up with, they had already dealt with 4 satyrs of the abyss. The large beasts in this forest seemed to have been treated as food by the satyrs and turned into dried, waxy corpses. Now that the smell of rotten meat suddenly appeared, the situation was obviously not right. Everyone felt that it was very likely that they had encountered a new species of monster. The method they used to deal with the satyrs could not be used again. In the middle of the forest there was a small campsite. In the middle was a tent. On the 2 sides of the tent were logs on the ground. There were a few tallow candles with windshield. A forest ranger was in the campsite, but he was not alone. The scene in front of him made Harriman feel a little nauseous. Galander roared and raised his axe, while Keyes silently took out the musket on his back and raised it. The white, hairless creatures that had pounced on the forest ranger and gnawed on his body turned around, their beast-like faces showing surprise. There were 5 of them in total. Although they were slender, they were muscular, had sharp claws and teeth, and their stomachs were bulging like balloons. One of them let out an ear-piercing roar, sounding like the noisiest bat. Then, with a low growl, they jumped out of the campsite and pounced towards the group of 4. Galander roared excitedly, bypassing Harriman and Keyes and rushing towards the incoming ghouls. "Ha, you hairless hyenas, come to me!" 3 of the ghouls pounced towards him, while the other 2 went around him and pounced towards Harriman and Keyes respectively. Harriman took a step back, dodging the sharp claws of the ghouls. However, the ghouls immediately jumped up after landing on the ground and crashed into him. Compared to their size, the ghouls were unusually heavy. Harriman was caught off guard and fell to the ground. The ghouls pounced on him, their twisted human-like faces reaching towards his face. Their beast-like mouths were filled with sharp teeth, eager to bite off a piece of flesh from his face. Without waiting for the others to help, Harriman kicked the ghoul away. Taking advantage of the gap, he used his longsword to slash its stomach. The ghouls screamed and pounced towards him again. Harriman quickly took off his cloak and covered it. The ghouls struggled under the cloak. Harriman endured the nausea and stepped forward with his sword, piercing through the monster. The ghouls screamed and fell to the ground, trembling. Harriman endured the nausea and took back his cloak, which was now stained with the ghouls' black blood. He kicked the corpse to the side in disgust and prepared to help Keyes. However, the young gunslinger obviously did not need help. Harriman had never seen him perform in close combat. The front end of the musket was equipped with a sharp bayonet. Keyes stabbed it a few times and the ghouls attacking him had their guts ripped out. His originally calm and indifferent face was now filled with disgust. At this moment, another ghoul flew out from between the two of them, slamming into the wall and losing its breath. Harriman turned around and saw Golander stepping on the head of another ghoul, lifting the last beast above his head. "Ha! My axe is not your cup of tea, eh?" the strong dwarf said with a smile. He raised his head and looked at the monster that was trying to bite him. He threw it onto its companion and chopped both ghouls in half with his axe. Chapter 1140. So these fellows are high on drugs. A team of shamans who were proficient in soul witchcraft, alchemists who were proficient in potions, and necromancers who often dealt with human bodies formed a research team. They worked together to dissect and conduct tests on the corpses that were carried up the city walls by Ulfric and his men. They finally came to a conclusion. They found a strange metabolic waste in the brains of the corpses. After a spellcaster led the reverse reduction work, they obtained some light yellow powder. And it was because of this that those people were willing to risk their lives during the day. Apart from that, the shaman sorcerer also tried to obtain more information from the souls of the two corpses' original owners. However, what he did not expect was that the souls of the two corpses had been contaminated to a certain extent. While it was normal for the souls of the dead to be muddle-headed, this muddle-headedness was accompanied by an indescribable feeling of ulceration. Even some Batsu devil could not bear to see this. This substance is a stain on the soul. After receiving the report from his subordinate, anger rose in Naman's heart for no reason. As a contract demon, he could sense the stench of an abyssal demon hidden deep within the small sample of light yellow powder that was handed over. It made him want to vomit. The false king, Vixius, is consciously preparing for a long war. The first batch of people he sent to attack should be felons from the southern country of Tap. During the dissection, we found word imprints on the chests of the two corpses. Seeing that the Supreme Commander was not worried, the person in charge of the research team who presented the report tried to shorten his speech as much as possible. We speculate that after the prisoners took this powder, they would develop a severe dependence on it in the short term. The inspection team sent by the false king distributed this powder so that the prisoners would willingly rush to the city walls and take the risk, or rather, send themselves to their deaths. If their deaths can cause casualties to the defenders, it would be the best thing for the false king, Vixius. Even if they only come to their deaths, Vixius can execute a large number of felons without moral condemnation and reduce financial pressure. If humans were vicious, even the purebred Batsu devil would be no match for them, Naman thought. This was a famous saying that the great master of the Megalosaurus, Keyes, once said. However, he was not completely unable to understand the actions of the false king, Vixius. In fact, he even vaguely agreed with him. Instead of leaving those felons to waste resources, it was better to turn them into sacrificial soldiers to contribute their last bit of strength. But the materials that Guy used to deal with the problem are too disgusting, Naman thought in disgust. This person first expressed his indignation, mainly towards the invasion of Tapt Island by the Soft Maple and Jomies Alliance, as well as their occupation of Valensburg. Then, he criticized the disgraceful actions of the defenders who had left the city in the middle of the night to kill the auxiliary soldiers who were collecting the corpses of the dead. Finally, this person proposed to the defenders in the city, "Surrender and hand over your weapons, and King Vixius can consider letting you leave Tapt Island without bloodshed under the supervision of the army." At the same time, he also said, "This is the last mercy that the king can give." However, as he was quite far from Valensburg, the only ones who could hear what he said were the defenders of Triangular Fortress outside the southern city gate. The ones who were stationed in this fortress were all from the Alliance Corps. There were a total of more than 400 soldiers, not to mention that most of them did not understand what he said. Even those who understood him cursed pygmies and responded with bullets from their guns. After failing to persuade them to surrender, the envoy turned his horse around and quickly returned to his camp. The Southern Subjugation Army's camp in Tapt, which was 3 to 4 miles away from Wallingsburg, was instantly bustling with activity. The squeaking of wheels, the low growls of cows, and the shouts of exhausted men echoed throughout the wilderness. In addition to the cannons set up at the artillery position yesterday, more than 10 medium-sized cannons had been transported overnight by Tapt. They were also mounted on huge flatbed carts. Each cart was pulled by more than 10 bulls, and many people were also dragging ropes as they slowly approached Valensburg. The artillery position built yesterday, which was made of mud, prefabricated wooden fences, and a small camp made up of about 100 artillery guards, had already been set up. The professional cannoneers who operated the cannons had already prepared the cannons in advance. At most, they only needed to observe through the cannon's lenses and make some simple adjustments to the firing parameters. Therefore, the cannons could be fired as long as they were placed on the ground. Seeing this situation, the basic commanders on the walls of Valensburg immediately made corresponding adjustments. Many centurions ordered their captains to take the time to use wooden beams as bone armor and many layers of sacks filled with mud to make simple anti-cannon holes. During the bombardment, the defenders could effectively reduce casualties by hiding in the holes. When the bombardment was over, they could come out and counterattack the enemies who were charging at the walls. However, what the defenders did not expect was that the commander of the subjugation army actually used the tactic of coordination between infantry and artillery. While they were preparing to deal with the bombardment, 3 companies of felons, about 100 people in total, similar to the ones that had attacked the walls of the water gate yesterday, quickly lifted the cover over their heads, ran out of the simple bunkers where they were hiding, and rushed toward the triangular fortress in front of the city gate. It turned out that last night, in addition to sending out auxiliary soldiers to collect the corpses, mainly returning weapons, Tapt had also sent the 3 newly armed 100-man teams to hide in the bunkers. It was all for the sake of launching a sudden attack at this time. As for when the trenches used to hide the soldiers were dug, the answer was between the first round of bombardment yesterday and the end of the bombardment. With the help of the concealment effect caused by the smoke, Tapt had sent out professional engineers to urgently dig out these bunkers. Without these bunkers, the felons who were charging at the triangular fortress had to first come out of the main camp, line up, and advance 2 to 3 miles. Then, they had to charge through the entire artillery coverage area of the Allied army before launching their assault. These people were not like the professional artillery soldiers who hid in the artillery positions, who could rely on the earth walls and slopes to avoid the enemy's bombardment. If they had to rely on their 2 feet to pass through the artillery coverage area in broad daylight, not many of these 3 companies would survive. With these bunkers, the artillery coverage area they had to rush through was only 1/3 of the original coverage area. As for the anti-tank cone area, which was originally meant to guard against coordination between infantry and artillery, it was basically no obstacle for pure infantry like them. In addition, the soldiers on the triangular fortress were preparing for the next bombardment. The three companies quickly ran through the anti-tank cone area, which was more than 500 paces away, and approached the triangular fortress standing in front of the city gate. During their assault, although there were people on the city wall who shot a few felons with flintlock rifles, these companies were not systematically wiped out. In particular, the few soldiers in charge of supervising the battle were still alive and well. Tap's side relied on these supervising soldiers. To be more precise, they relied on these people to distribute dependency drugs to the felons, to control the companies made up of felons. The reason they were able to execute the coordination between infantry and artillery tactic was, on one hand, because Tap's commander simply did not care about the lives of these companies. On the other hand, they relied on the on-the-spot command of the supervising soldiers. Fire at will. Don't stop. Grenadiers, throw out everything you brought. Climbing team, hurry up. As long as you occupy this fortress, each of you will be pardoned and receive ½ pound of silver cube coins. The supervising soldiers lowered their heads and shouted among the companies. The clothes they wore were similar to the felons, which also looked like long robes made of linen. At most, they added a warm cotton jacket and a tattered hat. But in fact, these people's cotton-padded clothes were specially made cotton-padded armors. Each piece of clothing had to be hammered repeatedly with cotton weighing a few kilograms, and iron plates were embedded in the key parts as protection. As long as they were not shot at close range or using powerful firearms, these soldiers had a high chance of survival with the help of the cotton-padded armors they were wearing. The reason they were dressed like this was because they were worried that they would be easily discovered and attacked by the Joint Army's musketeers. After all, the real commanders of these three companies were actually the supervising soldiers mixed in with the crowd. On the battlefield, a newly armed felon could only focus on the enemy in front of him at most. A well-trained professional soldier was slightly better than the former. At the very least, they could focus on the situation within 2 to 3 yards of themselves. The low-ranking officers leading the operation had better vision than ordinary soldiers, but at most, they could only focus on the situation within 50 to 60 yards of themselves. Without these supervising soldiers mixed in with the crowd and cooperating with each other to give the order to attack, these companies of felons would probably be able to follow the initial order and jump out of the pit and run to the triangular fortress. When they arrived at the fortress, they would be in a mess and would not know what to do. However, when someone told them what to do, the result was very different. The soldiers who carried muskets and trident guns lit their slow matches soaked in salt, hung them on the rope clamps, and pulled the trigger casually at the top of the triangular fortress. Some grenadiers who didn't have muskets but carried a few ponytail grenades formed groups of 2 and hid from the people around them. One person inserted the ignited powder into the grenade, while the other person swung the grenade and threw it toward the top of the triangular fortress with the help of centrifugal force. Some felons who were originally carrying ladders quickly ran to the side of the wall and hung ladders that were more than 30 feet high with iron hooks on the top of the triangular fortress. Then, some soldiers who were wearing half-body plate armor and chain armor that were more eye-catching than the soldiers of the supervision team began to climb up the wall with short knives in their mouths. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.